The Atrocities of the Pirates by Aaron Smith. Section 0. Preface. The following narrative is so ample and circumstantial in its details, and the unparalleled barbarities witnessed and endured by Mr. Smith during his captivity by the pirates of Cuba are so clearly narrated, that it may appear scarcely necessary to detain the reader by prefixing anything by way of preface. But the author of the subsequent pages, who is now again employed in the duties of his profession, having, before he quitted England, committed his plain, unvarnished tale to the care of a friend, that friend conceives he cannot perform a more acceptable service to a brave and meritorious, though unfortunate man, than by submitting the same to the notice of a humane and generous public. While it is humbly conceived, no portion of that public will read the narrative without feeling emotions of a twofold and opposite kind, pity for a man who underwent such unmerited sufferings, and indignation at the base conduct of those who, with the means in their power, neglected to vindicate his injured honor, and to wipe off the stigma of his being a willing accessory to the unparalleled atrocities herein detailed. Aaron Smith was, on the 19th of December, 1823, tried on a charge of piracy before the High Court of Admiralty, and such was the zeal of his prosecutors to make an example of a British seaman, who had become, however involuntarily, the associate of a gang of pirates, that, notwithstanding all the perils and hardships he had undergone, he narrowly escaped an ignominious death, and that, too, by the laws of his own country, in whose service his previous life had been passed with credit and honor. Among the multiplicity of events, however, which take place in the metropolis and the varied contents of the newspapers, it is possible that his trial might not have been generally read, or that, if read at the time, the particulars may have escaped the recollection of those not immediately interested in its issue. On that account, therefore, a very brief outline of it is here given. Footnote: a copious and explicit report of his trial may be seen in the Morning Chronicle of December 20, from which the above account is abridged. End footnote. At the High Court of Admiralty, Friday, December 19th, 1823, Aaron Smith took his trial, being charged with seizing the ship Victoria, the property of Hyman Cohen and others, and stealing 636 barrels of coffee, value £5,000, and 100 barrels of coffee, value £1,000. He was also charged with seizing the ship Industry on the high seas on the 7th of August, 1822. Several witnesses, seamen and others on board the ships just mentioned, were called in support of the prosecution, who severally deposed to the active part taken by the prisoner during their capture. Some of whom, however, admitted that in his conduct he evinced more forbearance than the ferocious crew by whom he was surrounded. The prisoner, being called on for his defense, entered into a detail of the compulsory nature of his actions, solemnly declared that he had never participated in the unlawful booty, and recounted with much feeling the circumstances of his captivity and the horrid cruelties that had been inflicted on him by the merciless fury of that monster, the captain of the pirates. His defense was natural and unaffected, and appeared, from the effect it had upon the auditory, to carry home conviction to every bosom. He then called upwards of 20 respectable witnesses, who spoke in unqualified terms with regard to his humanity, bravery, and the general excellence of his character. Among these were Captain Hayes, the commander of the ship on board of which Aaron Smith had been mate, and his brother, Mr. John Smith, an officer in the Navy. But the witness who excited the most attention was Miss Sophia Knight, a female of considerable personal attractions, who proved that she had been intimately acquainted with the prisoner upwards of 3 years, that their marriage had been arranged, and that it would have taken place had not the prisoner been detained from his friends and his country by the fatal interposition of the savage horde into whose power he had been so unfortunately thrown. In giving her evidence, Miss Knight wept bitterly, and the manly cheek of Smith was likewise suffused with tears. The judge recapitulated the evidence, and the jury acquitted the prisoner. They did their duty, and they could do no more. The crime for which Aaron Smith was tried is undoubtedly one of the deepest turpitude, and one at which his honest mind revolted. But those who peruse the following pages will see that he was so completely in the power of that demoniacal crew of pirates, so involved in the meshes of their inextricable net, that neither bravery nor artifice, neither skill nor enterprise, could effect his deliverance. While groaning under the weight of his own sufferings, and looking forwards only to the means of escape, he was compelled to assume an air of satisfaction, and to join in the desperate acts of those freebooters. To elude their vigilance, and to avoid the terrible effects of their vengeance, it was imperative on him to act precisely in the way he did act. Any other line of conduct would, in fact, have subjected him to a horrible death, preceded perhaps by tortures at which the stoutest heart would have trembled. The Atrocities of the Pirates, by Aaron Smith. Section 1, Part 1. In the month of June, 1821, I embarked on board the merchant ship Harrington, and proceeded on a voyage to the West Indies. Subsequent events, however, induced me to resign my situation in that vessel and devote myself to other pursuits. After having passed nearly 2 years in that part of the world, and finding my health somewhat impaired by the climate, I became anxious to see my family once more, and made the necessary arrangements for my return to England. Being then at Kingston, in the island of Jamaica, I communicated my wishes to a Captain Talbot, an intimate friend, who very kindly undertook to forward my views, and introduced and recommended me to Mr. Lumsden, the master of the merchant brig Zephyr, which vessel was at that time waiting for freight to London. In consequence of this introductory recommendation, I entered into an agreement with that person to accompany him as his first mate, and about the middle of April, 1822, I commenced the duties of my office. The season that year had been very unfavorable to the planters. The crops had in many instances failed, and freights were in consequence very scarce. The lading of the Zephyr therefore proceeded very slowly, and I became daily more anxious for my return. In the meantime, I embarked in a trifling speculation, and purchased and shipped a quantity of coffee on board the brig on my own account, from time to time consulting and advising with Mr. Lumsden as to the best methods of completing our lading. Some time, however, still elapsed before we could attain our object, and during this interval I discovered so many unamiable traits in the character of that person as to cause very unfavorable impressions on my mind towards him. His ignorance and want of education betrayed themselves on almost every occasion. Nor was I surprised at the discovery, when I was afterwards informed that he had been originally bred to the coal trade, and had been nearly all his life employed in that capacity. Towards the latter end of June we had completed our cargo, and having taken on board our passengers, who consisted of a Captain Cooper, 5 or 6 children, and a black woman as a servant, we sailed on the 29th, and proceeded down to Port Royal, where we anchored for the night. Mr. Lumsden, with some friends belonging to the children, and a lady of color, at whose house he had lodged during his stay on the island, followed the vessel in a boat, and came on board at Port Royal. The boat was then sent for another passenger, and, on his arrival, the person who had accompanied Mr. Lumsden returned on shore. On the following morning we weighed anchor and left the port, and, having discharged the pilot, proceeded on our voyage with a moderate breeze and fine weather, but very soon afterwards encountered strong northeasterly winds, accompanied by a heavy swell from the eastward. Mr. Lumsden now seemed anxious to consult me as to future proceedings, and asked me whether I should deem it advisable for him to ply for the windward, or to bear up for the leeward passage. The opinion which I had formed of his character rendered me unwilling to hazard my advice, as I did not wish to have any responsibility thrown on me hereafter from what might be the result of his own ignorance and want of skill. As, however, I could not, consistently with my duty, altogether refuse my opinion, I confined my answer merely to pointing out the advantages and disadvantages of each, without evincing any prepossession in favor of either. The windward passage, I informed him, might prolong the voyage, but the leeward would expose us to the risk of being plundered by pirates and perhaps the total destruction of the vessel, of which the accounts in the daily journals gave too melancholy warnings, and therefore I should recommend him to be guided by his own judgment and experience. Without considering much upon the subject, he decided upon the latter, notwithstanding the perils to which such a measure might expose him. In consequence of this determination, we steered for the great Caymans, which islands the heavy sailing of the Zephyr and the unusual lightness of the winds prevented us from reaching until the fourth day. The inhabitants came off to us in canoes, and we purchased a few parrots, some turtles, and a quantity of shells. From thence we steered for Cape St. Antonio, the southwest point of the island of Cuba, and on our passage spoke to a schooner belonging to St. John's, New Brunswick, on her return from Kingston. This vessel had made an unsuccessful attempt to ply for the windward passage, and had abandoned it on the fifth or sixth day. We parted company in the night, and on the following morning made Cape St. Antonio. The wind was still light and the weather fine. Having got round the Cape, we stood to eastward, and the breezes freshened and became more favorable. At daylight on the following morning we discovered 2 sail ahead, standing the same course, and in the forenoon, the day being remarkably clear and fine, took a very good observation of the sun's altitude. At 2:00 P.M., while walking the deck in conversation with Captain Cooper, I discovered a schooner standing out towards us from the land. She bore a very suspicious appearance, and I immediately went up aloft with my telescope to examine her more closely. I was instantly convinced that she was a pirate, and mentioned it to Cooper, who coincided with me, and we deemed it proper to call Mr. Lumsden from below and inform him. When he came on deck we pointed out the schooner and stated our suspicions, recommending him to alter his course and avoid her. We were at this moment about 6 leagues from Cape Roman, which bore southeast by east. Never did ignorance, with its concomitant obstinacy, betray itself more strongly than on this occasion. He rejected our advice, and refused to alter his course, and was infatuated enough to suppose that because he bore the English flag, no one would dare to molest him. To this obstinacy and infatuation I must attribute all my subsequent misfortunes, the unparalleled cruelties which I have suffered, the persecutions and prosecutions which I have undergone, the mean and wanton insults which have been heaped upon me, and the villainy and dishonesty to which I have been exposed from the author of them all, who, not satisfied with having occasioned my sufferings, would have basely taken advantage of them to defraud my friends of what little of my property had escaped the general plunder. In about half an hour after this conversation, we began to discover that the deck of the schooner was full of men, and that she was beginning to hoist out her boats. This circumstance greatly alarmed Mr. Lumsden, and he ordered the course to be altered 2 points, but it was then too late, for the stranger was within gunshot. In a short time she was within hail, and, in English, ordered us to lower our stern boat and send the captain on board of her. Mr. Lumsden either did not understand the order, or pretended not to do so, and the corsair, for such she now proved to be, fired a volley of musketry. This increased his terror, which he expressed in hurried exclamations of "Aye, aye! Oh, Lord God!" and then gave orders to lay the main yard aback. A boat from the pirate now boarded the Zephyr, containing 9 or 10 men of a most ferocious aspect, armed with muskets, knives, and cutlasses, who immediately took charge of the brig, and ordered Captain Cooper, Mr. Lumsden, the ship's carpenter, and myself, to go on board the pirate, hastening our departure by repeated blows with the flat part of their cutlasses over our backs, and threatening to shoot us. The rapidity of our movements did not give us much time for consideration, and while we were rowing towards the corsair, Mr. Lumsden remarked that he had been very careless in leaving the books, which contained the account of all the money on board, on the cabin table. The captain of the pirate ordered us on deck immediately on our arrival. He was a man of most uncouth and savage appearance, about 5 feet 6 inches in height, stout in proportion, with aquiline nose, high cheek bones, a large mouth, and very large, full eyes. His complexion was sallow, and his hair black, and he appeared to be about 32 years of age. In his appearance he very much resembled an Indian, and I was afterwards informed that his father was a Spaniard, and his mother a Yucatan squaw. He first addressed Mr. Lumsden, and inquired in broken English what the vessels were that he saw ahead. On being informed that they were French merchantmen, he gave orders for all hands to go in chase. The Zephyr was observed in the meantime to make sail and stand in the direction of Cape Roman. The captain now addressed himself to Mr. Lumsden on the subject of his cargo, which he was informed consisted of sugars, rum, coffee, arrowroot, dye woods, etc. He then severally inquired who and what we were, and then whether we had spoken any vessel on our passage. On being informed of the schooner from New Brunswick, he asked if we thought she had specie on board. We told him that those vessels in general sold their cargoes for cash, and he seemed very anxious to learn whether she was ahead or astern of us, and whether she was armed. Mr. Lumsden now entreated the captain to make a signal to the Zephyr not to stand nearer to the land, as he was apprehensive of her going on shore, and was told that he need not be under any alarm, as there was a very experienced pilot on board of her. He was, however, dissatisfied with this reply, and repeated his entreaty, when the other, in a menacing tone, enjoined silence, and went forward. In a short time he returned and questioned Mr. Lumsden as to what money he had on board, and when told that there was none, he replied, "Do not imagine that I am a fool, sir. I know that all vessels going to Europe have specie on board, and if you will give up what you have, you shall proceed on your voyage without further molestation." Mr. Lumsden repeated his answer, and the pirate declared that if the money was not produced, he would detain the Zephyr, throw her cargo overboard, and if any was found concealed, he would burn her with every soul belonging to her. He then asked whether there were any candles, wine, or porter on board, and Mr. Lumsden foolishly replied, not any that he could spare, without appearing to consider that we were in his power, and that he could, if he pleased, possess himself of anything he might wish without consulting his convenience. The night was at this time fast approaching, and the breeze had begun to die away. The captain appeared to despair of coming up with his chase, which we could now clearly perceive to be a ship and a brig, and asked Captain Cooper and myself whether he should be able to overtake them before dark. We replied in the negative, and he then gave orders to shorten sail and stand towards the Zephyr. The pirates then began to prepare for supper, and were very liberal in serving out spirits to our boat's crew, and also offered us a share or wine if we preferred it, but we declined both. The captain now turned to me and said that as he was in a bad state of health and none of his ship's company understood navigation, he should detain me for the purpose of navigating the schooner. I tried as much as possible to conceal my emotions at this intimation, and endeavored to work upon his feelings by telling him that I was married and had 3 children, that they, together with my wife and aged parents, were anxiously expecting me at home, and represented in as pathetic language as I could the misery and distraction which it would cause them, beseeching him to spare my wife and children, and not bring down the gray hairs of my unfortunate parents with sorrow to the grave. But I appealed to a monster, devoid of all feeling, inured to crime and hardened in iniquity. Mr. Lumsden in the meantime interfered, and hoped that he would not deprive him of my services; but he savagely told him, "If I do not keep him, I shall keep you." This threat evidently alarmed and agitated him, and he seemed to regret the part he had taken. A few minutes, however, displayed the unfeeling and selfish character of this man in the strongest light. "Mr. Smith," said he, turning to me, "for God's sake do not importune the captain, or he will certainly take me. You are a single man, but I have a large family dependent upon me, who will become orphans and be utterly destitute. The moment I am liberated, I shall proceed to the Havana and dispatch a man of war in search of the corsair, and at the same time publish to the world the manner in which you have been forcibly detained. Nay, I will represent the whole affair at Lloyd's, and should the pirate be captured hereafter, and you found on board, no harm shall befall you. Whatever property you have shall be safely delivered to your family, and mine will forever bless you for the kind and generous act." During this address he was much affected, and the tears streamed from his eyes. I sympathized in his feelings, and replied that I hoped that neither of us would be detained; but if the lot must fall upon one under these circumstances and on these conditions, I would consent to become the victim. This declaration calmed his agitated spirits, but little did I think of the treachery and duplicity that had been masked beneath them, and which subsequent events have too clearly demonstrated. Supper having been prepared, the captain and his officers, 6 or 7 in number, sat down to it, and invited us to join them, which, for fear of giving offence and exciting their brutality, we did. Our supper consisted of garlic and onions chopped fine and mixed up with bread in a bowl, for which there was a general scramble, every one helping himself as he pleased, either with his fingers or any instrument with which he happened to be supplied. During supper, Mr. Lumsden begged to be allowed to go on board the Zephyr to the children, as he was fearful that they would be alarmed at our absence and the presence of strangers, in which request I joined. But he replied that no one would injure them, and that, as soon as the 2 vessels came to an anchor, he would accompany us on board. The corsair was at this time fast approaching the Zephyr, when the captain ordered a musket to be fired, and then tacked in shore. The signal was immediately answered, and the brig followed our movements. One of our boat's crew was then ordered to the lead, with directions to give notice the moment he found soundings, and the captain then inquired if we had any Americans on board as seamen. He expressed himself very warmly against them, and declared he would kill all belonging to that nation in revenge for the injuries that he had sustained at their hands, one of his vessels having been lately taken and destroyed by them; adding, at the same time, that if he discovered that we had concealed the fact from him, he would punish us equally. To the Americans he said that he should never give quarter, but as all nations were hostile to Spain, he would attack all. The man at the lead, during this conversation, gave notice of soundings in 14 fathoms, and the captain ordered the boat down, and told Mr. Lumsden he would accompany him on board his vessel. The men we had brought were ordered into the boat, but Captain Cooper, the carpenter, and myself were not allowed to go into her. The boat then proceeded towards the Zephyr, with Mr. Lumsden and the captain of the Corsair, and shortly after returned with some of the men whom the pirate had put on board, who brought with them Captain Cooper's watch, the ship's spy glass, and my telescope, together with some of my clothes and a goat. The goat had no sooner reached the deck than one of these inhuman wretches cut its throat, and proceeded to flay it while it was yet alive, telling us at the same time that we should all be served in the same manner if no money was found on board. The Corsair had then got into 4 fathoms water and came to an anchor, as also did the Zephyr about 50 yards from her, and the pirates that were on board began hailing their companions and congratulating one another at their success. The watch on board the Corsair was now set, and Captain Cooper, the carpenter, and myself were ordered to sleep on the companion. Thither we repaired, but to sleep was impossible. The carpenter then took an opportunity of informing us that there was specie on board, and expressed his apprehension that, if discovered, the cruel threat would be put into execution. Captain Cooper and myself, however, were ignorant of the circumstance, and felt rather inclined to believe that the carpenter was mistaken, but he assured us that such was the case, and that Mr. Lumsden had consulted him a day or two before about a place for its concealment. The expression which had dropped from him in the boat then occurred to us, but we still felt inclined to believe that it was some private money of his own. The whole night was passed in giving way to various conjectures, and hope and fear, and the dread of assassination completely drove sleep away. Each reflected on what might be his future fate, and imparted his hopes or his apprehensions to his fellow sufferers. At daylight we perceived the pirates on board beating the Zephyr's crew with their cutlasses, and began to tremble for our own safety. After this we perceived the sailors at work hoisting out their boats, and hauling a rope cable from the after hatchway, and coiling it on deck as if preparing to take out the brig's cargo. The crew of the Corsair meanwhile began to take their coffee, and the officers invited us to partake of some, which we willingly did, and found it very refreshing after a night spent in sleepless apprehension. At 7 o'clock the captain hailed his crew from the Zephyr, where he had passed the night, and ordered the boat to be sent, in which he returned in a short time with some curiosities belonging to myself. On his arrival he approached me, and, brandishing a cutlass over my head, told me to go on board the Zephyr and bring everything necessary for the purposes of navigation, as it was his determination to keep me. To this mandate I made no reply, so, brandishing his cutlass again, he asked me with an oath if I heard him. I replied that I did, when, with a ferocious air, he said, "Mind and obey me then, or I'll take off your skin." At this threat I went into the boat and pulled towards the Zephyr, and on my arrival found Mr. Lumsden at the gangway. I told him the nature of my visit, at which he expressed his sorrow, but advised me not to oppose the pirate, lest it might produce bad usage, as he seemed bent upon detaining me. He then informed me that they had taken possession of everything, and that he himself had narrowly escaped assassination on account of his watch. On entering my cabin I found my chest broken to pieces, and its contents taken away, with 2 diamond rings and some articles of value. From a seaman I received my gold watch, sextant, and some other valuable things, which I had previously given to him to conceal, and with these I returned to my own state room, and proceeded to pack up what few clothes had been left by the plunderers. My books, parrot, and various other articles I gave in charge to Mr. Lumsden, who engaged to deliver them safely into the hands of my friends should he reach England. The corsair had, during the interim, weighed anchor and hauled alongside of the Zephyr, and, having made fast, the crew had commenced moving all the trunks on board of her. Among these was the desk of Captain Cooper, containing all his papers and vouchers, which he begged me to claim as mine and recover for him, for which purpose he gave me the key. Well aware of the serious loss he would sustain, I undertook the dangerous task, and, passing into the corsair, informed the captain that my desk had been taken, and begged, as it only contained papers, which were of importance to my family, that it might be restored. He ordered me to open it, and, having examined the interior, he granted my request, and I had the pleasure of obliging Captain Cooper, who, in return, promised to represent my case to the underwriters at Lloyd's. The pirates next commenced taking out the Zephyr's cargo, at which Mr. Lumsden and myself were compelled to assist; but the former was soon after removed on board the schooner, in consequence of the crying of the children, who, the captain said, had been instigated by him to do so. There he was employed in striking the cargo into the hatchways. The pirates in the meantime became intoxicated, and gave way to the most violent excesses. All subordination was at an end, and equality seemed to be the order of the day. Mr. Lumsden was now called on board the Zephyr, and questioned as to the cargo down the main hatchway, when he read and explained the manifesto. Orders were immediately given to 4 sailors and myself to prepare for hoisting the cargo up, and to clear away the dye wood that was in our way. Mr. Lumsden directed us to throw it overboard, which we commenced doing, and threw some over; but this was prevented by the captain, who said that he only wanted to throw the ship's cargo overboard, in order to say that it was taken from him, and defraud the underwriters. We continued our occupation until we had hoisted up 2 scroons of indigo, a quantity of arrowroot, and as much coffee as they thought sufficient. The seamen were then ordered to send down the foretop gallant mast and yard, both of which were taken on board the pirate, with whatever spars they thought would be of utility. Even the playful innocence of the children could not protect them from the barbarity of these ruffians. Their earrings were taken out of their ears, and they were left without a bed to lie upon, or a blanket to cover them. They next commenced taking out the ship's stores, with all the live stock and some water, and Mr. Lumsden and Captain Cooper were then ordered on the quarter deck, and told that if they did not either produce the money, or tell where it was concealed, the Zephyr should be burned and they with her. On this occasion the same answer was given as before, and the inhuman wretch instantly prepared to put his threat into execution, by sending the children on board the schooner, and ordering those 2 gentlemen to be taken below decks, and to be locked into the pumps. The mandate was no sooner issued than it was obeyed by his fiend like myrmidons, who even commenced piling combustibles round them. The apparent certainty of their fate extorted a confession from Lumsden, who was released and taken on deck, where he went to the round house and produced a small box of doubloons, which the pirate exhibited with an air of exultation to the crew. He then insisted that there was more, and, notwithstanding that the other made the most solemn asseverations to the contrary, and that even what he had given was not his own, he was again lashed to the pumps. The question was then applied to Captain Cooper, and fire was ordered to be put to the combustibles piled round him. Seeing his fate inevitable, he offered to surrender all he had, and, being released, he gave them about 9 doubloons, declaring that what he had produced was all he had, and had been entrusted to his care for a poor woman, who, for aught he knew, might at this moment be in a state of starvation. "Do not speak to me of poor people," exclaimed the fiend. "I am poor, and your countrymen and the Americans have made me so. I know there is more money, and will either have it or burn you in the vessel." The unfortunate man was then once more ordered below, and fire directed to be applied. In vain did they protest that he had got all. He persisted in his cruelty, The flames now began to approach their persons, and their cries were heart-rending, while they implored him to turn them adrift in a boat at the mercy of the waves, rather than torture them thus and keep the Zephyr, when, if there was money, he would surely find it. Finding that no further confession was extorted, he began to believe the truth of these protestations, and ordered his men to throw water below and quench the flames. The unfortunate sufferers were then released and taken into the round house, and the seamen, children, and myself allowed to go on board the brig. There we were, left for a while at liberty, while the pirates caroused and exulted over their booty. When they had finished their meal, the captain told them that it was now time to return to their own vessel, and ordered me to accompany them. I hesitated at first to obey, but he was not to be thwarted, and drawing his knife, threatened with an oath to cut my head off if I did not move instanter. I thought it best to pretend ignorance of his order, and said that I had not heard him at first, and hoped, as I had some accounts to settle with Mr. Lumsden, that he would give me time to do so before he took me away. He complied, with some difficulty. I then requested Mr. Lumsden to sign a written bill of lading for the 2 tierces of coffee belonging to me on board, consigned to Mr. Watson, ship chandler, in London, and also a promissory note for £18 10s, payable to the same person, on account of moneys due to me. Having made these arrangements, I returned on board the schooner, and the captain asked me if I had my watch. I answered in the affirmative. He took it from me and looked at it, and, admiring it, gave very strong hints that he should like to have it. I took no notice of the hint, and said that it was a gift from my aged mother, whom I never expected to see again, and should like to send it to her by Mr. Lumsden. But I was afraid that his people would take it away from that person if I gave it into his hands. "Your people have a very bad opinion of us," he replied, "but I will convince you that we are not so bad as we are represented to be. Come along with me, and your watch shall go safely home." Saying this, he took me on board the Zephyr, with the watch in his hand, and gave it to Mr. Lumsden, and desired his people not to take it from him on any account. I then asked to remain awhile and bid farewell to the children and crew, which he, with some difficulty, allowed me to do. In this interval, the owner's son, who was on board learning navigation, said that his quadrant and all his clothes had been taken away, and begged me to recover them for him, if possible. I promised him I would do my best, and represented to the pirate that he was the son of poor parents, and could ill afford the loss, and begged that they might be restored. He sulkily replied that I was presuming too much, but this must be my last request, and the lad might have his things, with the exception of checked shirts, which must be left for his crew. Having performed this good office, the captain became impatient for my return, and I was obliged to take a hasty but affecting leave of my former messmates, to become one of a desperate banditti. The inhuman wretch thought even this affecting ceremony too long, and drove me on board at the point of his knife. When I had reached the deck of the Corsair, he asked me if I had got every instrument necessary to the purposes of navigation, and if not, to go and get them, for he would have no excuses by and by, and if I made any he would kill me. I answered that I had got all that was necessary, and he then gave orders to cast loose from the Zephyr, and told Mr. Lumsden he might proceed on his voyage, but on no account to steer for the Havana, for if he overtook him on that course, he would destroy him and his vessel together. He promised that he would not touch there, and the vessels were accordingly cast loose in a short time afterwards. Mr. Lumsden, Captain Cooper, and the children stood on the gangway and bade me adieu, and my heart sunk within me as the 2 vessels parted. The horrors of my situation now rushed upon my mind. I looked upon myself as a wretch upon whom the world was closed forever. Exposed to the brutality of a ferocious and remorseless horde of miscreants, doomed to destruction and death, and perhaps to worse, to disgrace and ignominy; to become the partaker of their enormities, and be compelled, I knew not how soon, to imbrue my hands in the blood of a fellow creature, and perhaps a fellow countryman. The distraction, grief, and painful apprehensions of my parents, and of one to whom I was under the tenderest of all engagements, filled my mind with terror. I could no longer bear to look upon the scene my fancy presented to me, and I would have sought a refuge from my own miserable thoughts in self destruction; but my movements were watched, and I was secured, and a guard set over me. The captain then addressed me, and told me that if I made a second attempt I should be lashed to a gun, and there left to die through hunger; and, for the sake of security, ordered me below, but at my earnest entreaty I was allowed to remain on deck till it was dark. Section 2, Part 2. The Zephyr had got under way, and had set her sails, but I could perceive that her boats had either been cut or set adrift. This did not escape the notice of the pirate, who called to me and said, "Look at that rascal, he has cut loose his old boats, and when he gets home he will say that I have taken them, and get new ones from the underwriters; but I will write to Lloyd's and prevent it." He then appeared very anxious to know whether I thought they would go to the Havana, of which he seemed so apprehensive, that he would have gone after the Zephyr and destroyed her, had I not said that they would in all probability pursue a direct course. The wind was light and the sea calm, but the weather was thick and heavy. Both vessels moved slowly through the water from one another, and I kept my eyes upon the Zephyr as long as she was visible, and then gave way to melancholy reflections on my forlorn and wretched condition. At dusk we anchored at the edge of the reef, and a boat was dispatched to the shore, to inform the inhabitants of their good success. At daylight the pirate stood to the southwest, and at 9 o'clock in the morning entered a delightful harbor, where she anchored in 2 fathoms water. This harbor, called by the Spaniards Rio Medias, is large, commodious, and capable of containing 100 sail. The anchorage is good, being a compound of clay and mud, and it is protected from every wind except the north. Vessels within it ride very safe and easy, as the reef breaks off the force of the sea. The distance of it is about 3 miles from the edge of the reef to the southward, and the entrance intricate and hazardous. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon I perceived a number of boats and canoes pulling towards the Corsair, and the captain told me that he expected a great deal of company from the shore, and among others 2 or 3 magistrates and their families, and some priests, observing also that I should see several pretty Spanish girls. I remarked that I wondered he was not afraid of the magistrates. He laughed, and said I did not know the Spanish character. Presents of coffee and other little things, said he, will always insure their friendship, and from them I receive intelligence of all that occurs at the Havana, and know every hostile measure time enough to guard against it. 2 magistrates, a priest, and several ladies and gentlemen now came on board, and were received in great pomp by the captain, whom they congratulated on his success. I was then introduced to them as a captive, detained to navigate the vessel, and underwent much questioning from all of them, as to my country, and whether I came from London, and of what religion I was. Refreshments were then introduced, and the whole party drank the captain's health. Dancing was then proposed by the females, and preparations made for it. The parties stood up for their favorite amusement, and, to my great annoyance, I was selected as a partner for one of the magistrate's daughters. I declined the honor that was intended me rather abruptly, but the young lady herself, notwithstanding my apparent rudeness, pressed me to know the cause of my refusal. I told her candidly that my thoughts were too much occupied by my melancholy situation, and the misery which it would occasion my wife and family, to take any interest in the amusement. "You cannot be a married man," replied she, with an air of naïveté, "for I have been told that when people are married they always endeavor to conceal it." I repeated that I was, and she applied to the captain, who replied that I had told him so, but he did not believe it, as Mr. Lumsden had assured him to the contrary. She said that she had heard a great deal of the gallantry of my countrymen, but she had never seen one of them until now. I hoped, I replied, that she would not form an unfavorable opinion of them from my want of it, but that my mind was so agitated and my spirits so depressed that I must entreat her to excuse my not accepting the high honor that was intended me by selecting me as her partner. She said, with a look that clearly indicated that she felt as she spoke, that she sincerely pitied me and felt deeply interested in my behalf, and that if it was possible for her either to alleviate my sufferings or to procure my liberty, she should be happy in doing so, and would endeavor to persuade her father to exert his influence and have me released. I beseeched her not to be rash in her application, for if the captain should discover that I was endeavoring secretly to interest either her or her father in my behalf, it might cost me my life. Our conversation was here interrupted by the captain, who, seeing that he did not join the dancers, asked the cause, and, on being informed, roughly ordered me to lead the young lady out immediately, a mandate that I did not dare to disobey. As I shall have occasion to mention this young lady very often in the course of this narrative, it may be as well for me here to give some description of her. Her Christian name I afterwards discovered to be Seraphina, by which I shall hereafter designate her. Her family name I never knew. She was young and evidently unacquainted with the world, and therefore ignorant of the artifices practiced in it. She was unembarrassed in her manners, and there was an openness and frankness in all that she said or did, that, under any other circumstances, might perhaps have had a more powerful influence. Her features were regular and pretty, but not handsome, and her eyes sparkling, animated, and full of intelligence. She was a brunette, and her whole appearance was of that description which interests the beholder, almost at first sight. In her disposition she was kind, benevolent, and humane, and possessed of strong and warm feelings, which were very manifest when she was interested in anything. During the dance I could plainly perceive that she was hurt at the arbitrary conduct of the captain, and she very soon pleaded indisposition and sat down. The instant the attention of the party was diverted from her, she regretted, in a mournful tone of voice, the unpleasant sensations of which she must have been the cause, and then, as if rallying her spirits, passed on to indifferent subjects and made many inquiries into our manners and customs, asking me if all the stories she had heard of the grandeur and riches of London were true, and what sort of a building the immense church was that everybody went to see. The manner in which she entered into conversation, and the very great degree of feeling and interest that she betrayed on my account, led me to flatter myself that I had made some tender impressions on her heart. Pity, I had heard say, was akin to love, and methought if I should be happy enough to inspire her with the latter passion, she might become instrumental in my escape. My opinion, however, of the Spanish character was not very high. I suspected treachery might lurk beneath this apparent warmth of feeling, and was determined to meet stratagem by stratagem, if such should be the case. I hinted, therefore, that my holding her so long in conversation might give offence to her father, as I was an utter stranger and a mere captive. She replied, not at all, as he was an indulgent parent, and never interfered with her. Having so far satisfied myself, I endeavored to obtain some knowledge of the situation of the country, and what towns or villages were along the shore. This naturally led to the question whether I should like to go on shore, and I replied in the affirmative, making a bad state of health as a plea for my wishes. She immediately volunteered to obtain me the pirate's permission to go there, and said she had a ready excuse, without implicating me in the application, which was, that most of the inhabitants had never seen an Englishman, and my being allowed to go to the village would be conferring a favor on them, and would gratify their curiosity. The rest of the party were, at this time, engaged in the dance, and her father and the priest were enjoying their wine, which they praised as the finest they had ever tasted. All, therefore, had been too busily employed to have observed us. Seraphina now left my side and went to the captain, and in a few moments I saw her in earnest conversation with him, and I easily guessed the subject of it. I saw that the result was not favorable, as she evidently left him chagrined, and then went to her father. After exchanging a few words with him, he rose and accompanied her towards the captain. This mutual explanation raised my hopes, and, as she had before said that if permission was obtained a horse should be waiting on the beach to convey me to her father's house, I resolved to take advantage of that circumstance to escape. But alas! those hopes were ill founded. She soon returned to inform me that the pirate was inexorable, and had positively denied the favor, although her father had promised to become responsible for my safety. As the day was far spent, the visitors began to talk of returning, and the dance broke up. Refreshments of fowls and sweetmeats, which had been taken from the Zephyr, were then served up, but there was no want of knives, forks, or spoons, as on former occasions, as the pirates had secured those belonging to the brig. When they had refreshed themselves, the captain commenced the distribution of wines and other things as presents to his guests. A trunk, belonging to me, that contained linen and silks, fell to the lot of the priest, who was highly pleased, and told the captain he might be assured of his prayers, and indeed ought to attribute his present success to the intercessions which he had made with the Virgin. All, indeed, appeared gratified with their treatment, and told the captain that they had sent information round the country that the corsair had rums, sugars, and coffee for sale, who replied that if they meant to come and purchase, they must do so quickly, as he should go on a cruise in a day or two. While the rest were thus engaged, Seraphina imparted to me the ill success of her mission, and said that the priest had also unwittingly joined in her request. She then assured me of her esteem and her future exertions, promised to visit me often, and took leave of me. The party now took to their boats and canoes, and the priests, in descending, invited the captain to dine with him, and to be sure and bring me with him when he came. As soon as the party had gone, the captain came to me, and inquired whether I had commissioned Seraphina to make the request. As I was prepared for this question, I immediately answered in the negative, and added that I could have no object in going on shore, as I was a stranger, and as to escape, that was out of the question, as I was totally unacquainted with the face of the country. He then said if I behaved well he would take me with him, and immediately turned the conversation on the influence which he possessed with the magistracy of the whole island, saying that he could obtain passes for himself and his crew at all times to travel from one part to another. These passes, from what I could understand, are passports issued and signed by the different magistrates, without which persons travelling are liable to be thrown into prison, unless they can give a good account of themselves. The captain was at this very time much intoxicated, as was usually the case with him in the afternoon, and when in that state was wantonly cruel. Something just then excited his brutal temper, and he hastily drew his knife and told me to go down into the cabin, and not come on deck any more, and that I must in future lie on the bare floor. I pleaded my ill health and begged a mattress, but he replied that he always slept on the deck himself, and I must do the same, nor would he have his cabin lumbered up. His usual berth was on deck at the cabin door, where also 2 or 3 of his officers slept, so that it was impossible for any person to go out without awaking them. I passed the whole of the night in meditating on the means of escape, but almost every plan was abandoned as impracticable as soon as it was formed. In the morning, when the crew had breakfast and the decks had been washed, preparations were made for exposing their plunder for sale. About 11 o'clock, Seraphina and her father came, and after the usual compliments had passed between them and the captain, she came to me, shook me by the hand, seemed glad to see me, and remarked that I appeared in better spirits. She then informed me that her mother was very desirous of seeing me, and that her father had been prevailed upon to renew his application to the captain. I thought this a favorable opportunity to put my plan into execution, and told her how completely her kindness and benevolence had gained my heart, and that if ever I recovered my liberty, I should do all in my power to deserve her esteem. I then added that I was not a married man, but had made use of that artifice to preserve my liberty, and as that had failed, I thought it useless to persist in the declaration any longer. She appeared highly pleased at the confession, and I should have pursued the conversation, and in all probability elicited her sentiments, but for the arrival of strangers. The sale then commenced, and I was placed at the steel yards to weigh out the coffee to the purchasers. To this, however, they objected, as they suspected I would cheat them, but they had no alternative, as no one else understood the use of steel yards, and the captain having informed them that I was a captive, and bore no share in the profits, they were content to let the sale go on. The best coffee was sold for $10 per hundredweight, its supposed half value at Havana, and the inferior at a similar rate. I observed that the purchasers all brought sacks and bags with them, as precautionary measures to prevent detection and destroy every clue to the market in which it was purchased. Having weighed their several proportions, a gun was fired, when 2 schooners of a small size came out from the land, and, when within hail, were ordered to come alongside and take the coffee on board. Neither the captain nor any part of his crew understood arithmetic, so that my next task was to make out the several bills, and their amount having been paid, a large dinner was prepared from the stock taken from the Zephyr. While these preparations were going on, the captain told me, in English, which the rest did not understand, to make a strong mixture of spirituous liquors that would rapidly intoxicate, and bring it up after dinner as an English cordial. In the meantime he informed the company that after dinner he should set up to auction all the wearing apparel he had taken in this prize. They had all made perfectly free with the wine taken from the Zephyr, and the captain then told me to bring up the pretended cordial, which I had made from a mixture of wine, rum, gin, brandy, and porter, and recommended it to his guests, who drank it greedily and praised it. Its intoxicating effects were soon visible, and the auction then commenced. The different trunks were brought upon deck one by one, and as the contents of one was disposed of, another was opened, in order that the good and the bad might be sold alike. My own shared the fate of the rest, and I was obliged to see them pass into the hands of strangers without daring to claim them. The cordial now had its intended effect, and the state of intoxication in which they were caused them to contest every article, and accordingly enormous sums were bid for the most trifling. The sale being finished, they returned to the bottle, which gave me an opportunity of conversing with Seraphina, to whom I gave so glowing a description of everything in England that she said she would give worlds to see it. I then told her that were I at liberty, I should be happy to devote myself to her services; nay, that could I escape, and she would accompany me, I would, on my arrival, marry her. This sudden declaration startled her, and I began to be very much alarmed that I had by this imprudence destroyed the very foundation of the fabric that I was endeavoring to erect, and the more so when, with an air of unusually cold solemnity, she replied, that I ought to remember that I was a stranger and a foreigner, and therefore it would be highly imprudent and improper for her to trust herself to my protection, and, what was still more important, that it would be the height of ingratitude to quit, in a clandestine manner, the roof of such indulgent parents as hers. I acquiesced in the justice of these remarks, but at the same time used all the sophistry of which I was master to persuade her to think otherwise. To all my arguments she observed in reply, that should she consent to elope with me, 1,000 obstacles must be surmounted before it could take place. The lower order of Spaniards were avaricious and treacherous, and would commit any crime for the sake of money, and therefore could not be trusted. To traverse the immense forests without a guide was impossible, for to attempt it we should expose ourselves to destruction by wild beasts or starvation, and how to procure one that was trustworthy she knew not. I was glad to hear her talk in this manner, for I began to hope my arguments had had some effect, nor was I mistaken. After some further doubts and fears, she promised to consider and inquire on the subject, and if she found it practicable, she would consent to escape with me to the Havana, and thence to England. This promise overjoyed me, and I began to be sanguine in my hopes of escape. What the cordial had begun, additional quantities of wine had completed. The whole party were very much intoxicated, and universal disorder prevailed. A quarrel took place between two of the crew, and a desperate fight with knives ensued, of which the rest were cool spectators. The battle was for a long time doubtful, as both fought with equal skill and an equal degree of caution, notwithstanding they were intoxicated, until one fell with a severe stab in the left breast, bleeding profusely. I was instantly called to administer to the wounded man, and it was in vain for me to declare that I knew nothing of the healing art. The captain swore at me, and said he knew to the contrary; for the master of the Zephyr had informed him that I had cured and saved the life of his sailmaker, who had fallen down the hold, and therefore, if I did not cure him, he would serve me in the same manner. I saw it would be useless to make any reply, and therefore, having procured bandages, I staunched the blood and dressed his wounds in the best manner I was able. Having attended to one patient, I was then obliged to turn my attention to his antagonist, who had not escaped unhurt. When I had completed my task, I was carelessly complimented on my skill, and asked if the wound was mortal, which question I evaded by saying, "I hope not." This brutal exhibition rendered me quite melancholy, and while I was standing lost in thought, Seraphina came up to me and asked the reason. I told her, and added that such ruffianly conduct was not suffered in England. She said it was the custom of the country, and therefore I should not mind it. She then told me that she had been considering the subject of our conversation, and thought that it might be feasible, and was therefore determined to effect my liberation on the first favorable opportunity. Having thus raised my hopes, she went to her father, who was, like the rest of the party, much intoxicated, and tried to prevail on him to return, and after considerable difficulty succeeded in her wishes. This was a signal to the rest, and a general preparation for departure was the consequence. The schooners that had removed the coffee had already taken leave of us, and the boats and canoes of the party were now brought round, and they all rowed off, Seraphina taking a very affectionate leave of me. The guests were scarcely gone when the captain went below and inquired of the least injured of the wounded men the cause of their quarrel. He hesitated at first to tell, and supplicated that he might be forgiven for his neglect in not having furnished him with the important intelligence before. This being granted, He told the pirate that his antagonist was one of the party formed by the chief mate to assassinate him and the whole crew, and take possession of the ship and plunder. That officer, he informed him, had gone to the Havana for the express purpose of bringing some more men, and that they were to put the plan into effect when himself and the crew were either asleep or inebriated. I saw that his brutal temper was excited by this information. His eyes flashed fire, and his whole countenance was distorted. He vowed destruction against the whole party, and, rushing upon deck, assembled the crew, and imparted what he had heard. The air rang with the most dreadful imprecations. They simultaneously rushed below and dragged the helpless wounded wretch upon deck, and, without taking into consideration that the accusation against him might be unfounded, proceeded to cut off his legs and arms with a blunt hatchet. Then, mangling his body with their knives, threw the yet warm corpse overboard. Not contented with having destroyed their victim, they next sated their vengeance on his clothes and everything belonging to him, which they cut in pieces and threw into the sea. Having glutted their vengeance in this summary manner, they went below and questioned the informer as to his accomplices, but he told him that the murdered man was the only one of the conspirators on board; that he had been persuading him to join them, and, on his threatening to reveal the plot, had taunted him with cowardice, struck him, and provoked the quarrel in order to put him out of the way. The ruffians seemed satisfied with this answer, and the captain told me to pay particular attention to his wounds, and cure him as fast as possible. This dreadful scene threw a damp over my spirits. All hope of escape left me, and I looked upon every hour as my last, for I knew not how soon I might undergo the same fate. I determined, however, to be upon my guard, and, by a ready compliance in everything, prolong my existence, until Seraphina should have an opportunity of proving the sincerity of her promise. When this fury had subsided, the captain asked me what I thought of the Spanish mode of fighting, and added that I must learn the use of the knife, observing that it was the first thing his father had taught him. He then told me that if ever I knew or heard of anything inimical to himself or his crew going on, and did not give him information, I should undergo the same fate as the man whom they had just punished for his perfidy. The watch was then set, the crew sharpened their knives as if preparing for attack, and I was ordered down below for the night. Section 3, Part 3. The night passed off quietly, and in the morning I was directed to bend a new foretopsail. Every preparation was then made to go outside the reef. About noon a sail was discovered, and I was ordered aloft to examine, and report what description of vessel she was. When I had looked at her through my spy glass, I gave notice that it was a schooner standing westward. The captain asked me if she was a merchant or a man of war, and added, "Mind you do not deceive me, for if you do, I will cut off your head. I have already killed several of your countrymen, and take care you do not add yourself to the number." This threat made me apprehensive, and I was determined to examine her closely before I reported; and, having done so, told him she was a merchantman. The pirate was already under way, and she gave chase immediately. I was still at the masthead, and could perceive that the schooner was aware of our intention, and, suspecting us to be a pirate, was altering her course and standing to the north. I informed him of this circumstance, and he abused me for not doing so sooner. When we had passed through the channels and were without the reef, the wind died away, and the captain ordered out the sweeps, and the corsair made great way through the water. The breeze, however, soon freshened, and both vessels stood on under a press of sail. Before dark we were gaining rapidly upon her, but she was still at a great distance, and the captain despaired of reaching her, expressing his apprehension that she would escape, as she would most certainly alter her course in the night. At 10 o'clock at night she was out of view, and I was then ordered below. The captain declared, however, that he would stand on that tack until 2 in the morning, and if she was not then visible, he would alter his course to the east. The fatigue I had undergone by being tossed to and fro in the tops made me sleep soundly, and I did not awake till called in the morning. When I came on deck I found all at a loss to know whereabouts they were. The whole crew had been intoxicated, no light had been in the binnacle, and no log had been thrown. No one, therefore, knew what the ship had been doing through the night, or what sail had been set. In this dilemma I was called upon to give the captain information as to the bearings of the harbor from which we had sailed the preceding day. I replied that it was impossible for me to inform him exactly, and was threatened with instant massacre if I did not. I then informed him if he would wait till noon I would endeavor to do so, and the same threat was repeated in case of failure. It was a fortunate event for me that at this time the sun was in distance with the moon, and the sky being remarkably clear, the sea smooth, and the schooner making very little way, I had an opportunity, at about 9 o'clock, to take a good lunar observation. After I had completed taking the sights, which I was compelled to do above, as no one on board understood navigation, I made my calculations, and at noon obtained the true latitude by a good observation of the sun's altitude. To my great astonishment I found that we were about 20 leagues to the west-northwest of Cape Bonavista, a distance of 200 miles to the westward of where I had imagined we were. The moment the captain perceived that I had finished operations, he asked the situation of the vessel, which I informed him. He then ordered me to direct the helmsman, and trim the sails according to the course which we ought to steer. Having obeyed this order, he asked me when we should see land, and I told him in the afternoon, if the breeze was favorable. He seemed to have some doubt, and declared with an oath he would punish me if we did not. The breeze in the meantime freshened, and came more in our favor, and all appeared anxious to prove the truth of my information and be convinced of my skill as a navigator. But no one was more anxious than myself, for the least error in my calculation devoted me to destruction, and I trembled for the consequences. At 4 in the afternoon, to my great joy, the men on the lookout called "land," and the coast pilot complimented me on my skill. But the captain only abused me. "You rascal, you pretended not to know where the vessel was; but you see you cannot deceive me, and I would advise you not to attempt it." The pilot remarked that the current must have been running very strong. A very material error seems to exist in the charts, as well as the books of instructions on the subject of this current. Those which I have seen agree in stating that it runs to the eastward, whereas I have frequently found it to run westward at the rate of 3 knots, off Cape Roman, the Bay of Honda, the Camoeners, and at some distance from the land. Cape Bonavista, too, is erroneously laid down as high and mountainous, whereas the land about it is not more than 18 feet from the surface of the ocean, and that which is in general mistaken for it lies a great way to the interior of the island, and 6 leagues to the eastward of the cape. The Colorados, so little known, and so much dreaded by mariners, is also erroneously laid down, an error which frequently occasions a serious loss of lives and property. The north side of this reef may be approached without the smallest danger in the thickest darkness, by the precautionary throw of the lead, as the soundings gradually decrease from the depth of 50 fathoms till you come into 3. But frequently there is no dependence to be placed upon it, for at the distance of 6 yards there may not be more than 3 feet of water. Within the reef are a number of fine bays and inlets, capable of containing a large fleet. The whole coast indeed abounds with bays, creeks, and inlets little known to European navigators, that seem as if formed by nature for the reception and protection of those sanguinary hordes. While I had the misfortune of being among those miscreants, I have been, in several instances, in those places, within musket shot of British and American men of war, and could plainly perceive the men in their tops from the mast head of the corsair, without being perceived by them, the vessel being completely screened from observation by the trees. The coast pilot on board the corsair had certainly a very intimate knowledge of the whole coast, and knew every bay and inlet in it, and indeed boasted that that knowledge had for years been their protection, and assisted them in their depredations. Some had, according to their own confession, been 7 or 8 years at this lawless occupation. The corsair pursued her course along the land to the eastward till dusk, and then cast anchor. At daylight on the following morning she again made sail for the harbor, which she did not reach till 11, in consequence of the lightness of the wind. In the afternoon a boat full of men appeared coming towards the schooner, which, upon examination, was found to contain some of the chief mate's party. No sooner was this known than the captain declared he would kill them all, and ordered 30 muskets to be loaded and brought on deck. When the boat was about 200 yards from the schooner, the men ceased rowing, and held up a white handkerchief for a signal, as if doubtful of their safety, which was answered by a similar one from on board, and they again advanced. When within reach of the musketry, the dreadful order of "Fire" was given. 5 of the men fell in the boat, the 6th leaped over and began to swim, after whom a boat was dispatched. On his being brought on board, the captain told him the accusation that was against him and his party, and threatened him with a cruel and lingering death if he did not confess the whole truth. In vain did he declare his innocence and ignorance of any plot. The ruffian was resolved to glut his vengeance, and ordered him to be stripped and exposed naked, wounded and bleeding as he was, to the scorching fervor of a July sun, the July sun of a tropical climate. The feelings of humanity got the better of my caution, and I entreated the captain not to torture the poor wretch in that dreadful manner, declaring that I firmly believed him innocent; for, had he been guilty, torture and terror would have wrung a confession from him. In vain I pleaded. In vain I represented the inhumanity of punishing a poor wretch, in all probability innocent of the crime laid to his charge. He was deaf to my entreaties, and threatened me with vengeance for my interference, declaring that he had not done half that he intended to do. Having said this, he turned to the man, told him that he should be killed, and therefore advised him to prepare for death, or confess himself to any of the crew whom I chose to call aside for that purpose. The man persisted in his plea of innocence, declared that he had nothing to confess, and entreated them all to spare his life. They paid no attention to his assertions, but, by the order of the captain, the man was put into the boat, pinioned and lashed in the stern, and 5 of the crew were directed to arm themselves with pistols and muskets, and to go in her. The captain then ordered me to go with them, savagely remarking that I should now see how he punished such rascals, and giving directions to the boat's crew to row for 3 hours backwards and forwards through a narrow creek formed by a desert island and the island of Cuba. "I will see," cried he, exultingly, "whether the mosquitoes and the sand flies will not make him confess." Prior to our leaving the schooner, the thermometer was above 90° in the shade, and the poor wretch was now exposed naked to the full heat of the sun. In this state we took him to the channel, one side of which was bordered by swamps full of mangrove trees, and swarming with the venomous insects before mentioned. We had scarcely been half an hour in this place when the miserable victim was distracted with pain. His body began to swell, and he appeared one complete blister from head to foot. Often in the agony of his torments did he implore them to end his existence and release him from his misery; but the inhuman wretches only imitated his cries, and mocked and laughed at him. In a very short time, from the effects of the solar heat and the stings of the mosquitoes and sand flies, his face had become so swollen that not a feature was distinguishable, his voice began to fail, and his articulation was no longer distinct. I had long suspected that the whole story of the conspiracy was a wicked and artful fabrication, and the constancy with which this unfortunate being underwent these tortures served to confirm my suspicions. I resolved, therefore, to hazard my interference, and, after much entreaty and persuasion, prevailed upon them to endeavor to mitigate his sufferings and to let the poor wretch die in peace, as the injuries which he had already sustained were sufficient of themselves to occasion death. At first they hesitated, but, after consulting for some time among themselves, they consented to go to the other side of the island, where they would be secured from observation, and untie him and put something over him. When we had reached that place, we lay upon our oars and set him loose. But the moment he felt the fresh sea breeze, he fainted away. His appearance at this time was no longer human, and my heart bled at seeing a fellow creature thus tormented. When our time was expired, we again tied him as before to prevent the fury of the captain for our lenity, and once more pulled for the passage on our way to the vessel. On our arrival, his appearance was the source of merriment to all on board, and the captain asked if he had made any confession. An answer in the negative gave him evident disappointment, and he inquired of me whether I could cure him. I told him he was dying. "Then he shall have some more of it before he dies," cried the monster, and directed the boat to be moored within musket shot in the bay. This having been done, he ordered 6 of the crew to fire at him. The man fell, and the boat was ordered alongside. The poor wretch had only fainted, and when they perceived that he breathed, a pig of iron was fastened round his neck, and he was thrown into the sea. Thus ended a tragedy which, for the miseries inflicted on the victim, and for the wanton and barbarous depravity of his fiend like tormentors, never, perhaps, had its equal. The inhuman wretches who had been the chief participators in this horrid deed seemed to regard it as an everyday occurrence. The guitar tinkled and the song went round, as if nothing had happened, and the torments which their victim had just undergone, and the cries that he had uttered, seemed to form the subject of their jests, and to be echoed in their barbarous mirth. At 9 o'clock at night I was ordered below, as usual, but the image of what had occurred haunted my slumbers, and my sleep was broken by constant apprehensions of assassination. Morning brought round my appointed task of attending the sick, after which I was ordered to make a new gaff topsail. I went aloft and took the measure of the sail, and then informed the captain that it would be necessary to take the canvas on shore to cut it out. The very mention of the shore excited his fury, and he immediately accused me of intending to escape, observing that any endeavor would be fruitless, as he could have me apprehended in less than 2 hours after I should go. I told him I had merely said so with a view of expediting the work, and then proceeded to cut out the canvas upon deck in the best manner I could, using all diligence in making the sail. My exertions seemed to please him, and he frequently addressed me in a cheerful manner. Our attention was now excited by a cry of "A sail! A sail!" from the masthead, and I was driven up aloft with the usual threat to reconnoitre while the vessel got under way. I informed them that she was a merchant brig, and orders were given to go in chase immediately, the pilot undertaking to take her through the channels, while I was called down and consulted as to the best mode of fighting in case she should resist. The corsair, having gained on the brig, fired a gun and hoisted Spanish colors, which the other answered by heaving to and displaying the English ensign. From the painted ports and figure head of the brig, the pirate began to suspect that she was a man of war, and was fearful of approaching any nearer. He therefore ordered the foretopsail to be laid aback, and said that he should send the boat to board her under my directions. This intimation greatly alarmed me, and I pointed out to him the perils I should run in obeying his orders, and that, should I be captured hereafter, I should assuredly suffer an ignominious death. "And what are you, sir," cried he ferociously, "that you should not suffer as well as myself? The schooner shall never be captured, for when I can no longer defend her, I shall blow her up. If you do not instantly go, I will shoot you." I told him that he might shoot me if he pleased, but that I would not commit an act that might subject me and my family to disgrace. Seeing me resolute and inclined to dispute his authority, he ordered his crew to blindfold me and carry me forward, and told me to prepare myself for death. I was carried as he had directed, and he then came to me and asked me if I was prepared. I answered firmly, "Yes." He then left me, and immediately a volley of musketry was fired, but evidently only with a view to frighten me. The captain immediately came up to me and asked if I was not desperately wounded. I answered I was not, but begged, if it was his intention to destroy me, to do it at once, and not trifle with me, as I preferred death to disgrace and ignominy. He then gave directions that I should be taken and lashed to the mainmast, and the bandage removed from my eyes. This order was quickly obeyed by his myrmidons. As soon as I was fastened to the mast, the captain cut up a number of cartridges, and placed the powder round me on the deck, with a train to it, and gave orders for the cook to light a match and send it aft. He then repeated his order, and asked if I would obey him. I persisted in my refusal, and, without any further hesitation, he communicated the fire to the powder. The explosion deprived me of my senses and stunned me for the moment, but I soon recovered, to undergo the most horrid torture. The flames had caught my clothes, which were blazing round me, and my hands were so pinioned that I could not relieve myself. I begged them for God's sake to dispatch me at once, but they only laughed at me, and the captain tauntingly asked me if I would obey him now. The excruciating agony in which I was extorted my acquiescence, and I was ordered to be released, but I fainted before that could be done. When I recovered my senses, I found myself stretched on a mattress in the cabin, and in the most dreadful pain. In the frenzy and delirium of the moment, I meditated self destruction, but no weapons were near me, and the shattered state of my legs did not allow me to seek any. The steward was below, and I begged him to lend me his knife, but he suspected my intention, and informed the captain, who descended in a fury. "You want to kill yourself, young man, I understand," cried he, "but I do not mean that you should die yet. I shall blow you up again, for I see it is the only way to make you obey me." He then ordered them to keep a watch over me, and help me to sit up and dress my wounds. I found my legs dreadfully injured, the flesh lacerated, and the bone in some parts laid bare, and by this time large blisters had risen on various parts of my body. I asked for a sheet to cover me, and a pillow for my head, and the captain, who now seemed to relent, ordered the steward to give me all that I required. I begged that the medicine chest might be placed near me, which they did, and I seized that opportunity of swallowing the contents of a small vial of laudanum, about 130 drops, hoping that I should wake no more in this world. The cook, who seemed to pity and feel for my sufferings, now brought me a little arrowroot and wine, and made up my bed for me. I asked him where the corsair was, and he told me in the harbor at anchor. I expressed my surprise at the circumstance, when he informed me the captain was so convinced that the brig was a man of war, and that I had meant to decoy them to be taken, that he was afraid to attack, and had returned into harbor shortly after I was brought down below. From this poor fellow I received a great deal of kindness, and he seemed possessed of much humanity. "The captain," said he, bending over me with a look of compassion, "is a very bad man, and has killed more than 20 people with his own hand, in cool blood, and he would kill you too, were he not in want of your services." He then cautioned me to appear cheerful and satisfied at all times, and that then they would treat me well. He also told me that he would prepare any little thing for me that I might want, and attend me by day and by night; and, with this kind assurance, left me to my repose. I now began to feel the soporiferous effects of the laudanum, and, laying myself down upon my mattress, commended my soul into the hands of the God who gave it, beseeching him to forgive me for the act I had committed, and resigned myself, as I thought, into the arms of death. I soon fell into a profound sleep, which lasted the whole night, and in the morning they found such difficulty to arouse me that they imagined I had poisoned myself and was dead. The captain accused me of having done so, and threatened me with a second torturing if I ever made another attempt. I told him I had merely taken some opiate medicine to render me insensible to the pain I suffered, and that it had taken an unusually powerful effect upon me. He then asked me if I could attend to the sick. I said that I would endeavor to do so, but upon attempting to rise, I found my strength fail, and my limbs so stiff and in such a state that I began to think that I had lost their use. A mattress was, however, placed under me to help me to sit up, and the medicine chest placed by my side, and in this manner, although it put me to excruciating agony, I began to perform my task. Having attended to the sick, I next dressed my own wounds, which had assumed a dangerous appearance. While thus occupied below, the master of a coasting schooner brought intelligence that the Zephyr had arrived at the Havana, and that all the circumstances of her capture and plunder had been made known. Frantic at this information, he rushed into the cabin. "See," cried he, "what dependence can be placed on your countryman. That old rascal has gone to the Havana and broken a solemn promise. But for this I should not care, had he told the truth. He has told the authorities there that I have plundered him of specie to the amount of 1,500 pounds sterling, whereas I did not obtain half that amount. He has said also that I maltreated the children, and he must have known that it was only on their account that I did not destroy the vessel, but allowed him to proceed on his voyage. But this will be a lesson to me not to trust the English again, for I now find them as treacherous as the Americans." This he uttered all in a breath, and then paused as if considering something. A malignant scowl passed over his face, and he proceeded: "He thinks he is out of my reach, but mark me, if he remains a few days longer at the Havana, I shall never live to see England. I have 3 or 4 already on the watch to assassinate him. They must be new to the trade, or it would have been done ere this. But there is one on board who will soon accomplish it, a man who has already dispatched several. I shall send him there in an hour, and, to make sure of his performing it, I will give him 10 doubloons for the deed. Nay, should he be fortunate enough to escape this time, I may take him again at some other, and then I will tie him to a tree in the forest and let him starve." During this conversation the villain had been preparing himself, and now announced that he was ready to proceed on his sanguinary mission. The boat was then ordered to put him on shore, where he was to procure a horse and direct his course to the Havana; and the savage entered it with an air of exultation, and with loud promises of his performing his task faithfully. The hope of revenge seemed to have calmed his turbulence, and he began asking me how soon I should be able to proceed with the sail, and to go up aloft, adding that my own foolish obstinacy had occasioned all my sufferings. I told him that I was very ill, and could not then attempt it; to which he coolly answered that he was anxious to have the vessel completely fitted with new sails, and hoped that I should be able to do so very soon. He then turned about and left the cabin. The whole schooner's company now went to their evening meal, and, as was usual, to drink, play the guitar, and carouse. Their merriment was, however, soon interrupted by the dashing of approaching oars. They instantly flew to quarters, and made every preparation for acting on the defense, and I was dragged on deck, wounded as I was, to hail the boat in English. Immediately on my doing so, the boat stopped, and I repeated the hail, but they did not answer, upon which the captain called to them in Spanish. His voice was soon recognized, and they came alongside. All were eager to learn the object of their visit, and rapid in their inquiries. They then informed the captain that a boat containing some more of the chief mate's party had arrived, and, having heard of the fate of their associates, had vowed revenge. For this purpose they had gone in pursuit of the man who had been just set on shore, of whose arrival they were informed, and had, when they left, followed him towards the magistrate's house, where he had gone to procure a pass for his journey. They added that if he wished to preserve the man's life, he must lose no time in sending him assistance. A general panic seemed to have seized the whole crew at this intelligence, and no one seemed inclined to go upon this hazardous enterprise. The captain now upbraided, now threatened, and now abused them by turns, but with no visible effect, and was on the point of abandoning his emissary to his fate, when one man, apparently bolder than the rest, but evidently with hesitation, offered his services, and even declared his resolution to perish in the attempt. This example had the desired effect, and 9 more stepped forward. They were hastily supplied with arms and ammunition, and dispatched on shore, strictly charged by the captain to give the assailants no quarter. When this expedition was dispatched, the pirate asked me whether, if I had been well, I would have volunteered to rescue Stromita, for so the man was called. Wishing for an opportunity to lull his suspicions against me, I answered in the affirmative, adding at the same time that he ought to be on his guard, for this report might have been a stratagem to withdraw part of the crew, in order to attack the schooner more easily. The hint staggered him. He confessed the idea had never occurred to him, and thanked me for my precautionary advice, adding, "I see now that necessity is the best teacher, and I shall, at last, make something of you." I was then sent below again, and the captain proceeded to take measures to guard against surprise. A watch was set on deck, and every one lay down with his arms by his side. All was silence and watchful anxiety, till midnight, when the boat returned with only 5 of the men. These informed the captain that, on the beach, they had met a servant, dispatched by the magistrate, who informed them that Stromita was a prisoner, and that the captors had vowed to put him to death, and bade them hasten to his rescue. The party had, on hearing this, taken a circuitous route through the wood, and, having eluded the scouts of the chief mate's gang, had surprised 4 of them playing at cards and drinking under a tree. Having secured these, they proceeded to the magistrate's residence, and, firing through the doors and windows, discharged their blunderbusses into the house, regardless of who might be within, whether friend or foe, and had, in doing so, unfortunately wounded the magistrate himself. Stromita they found bound hand and foot, lying on the floor. But as he had not been injured, and having loosed him, he proceeded on his journey. 2 of the chief mate's party, they said, had been killed, 2 more were prisoners, and 2, who were acting as scouts, perceiving what had happened, had escaped after firing their muskets and wounding one of the corsair's crew. They concluded this long narration with an earnest request on the part of the magistrate and wounded man, that I might be instantly dispatched to dress their wounds, as there was no medical man near them. I was, in consequence, ordered to prepare for my new task as quick as possible. In vain did I remonstrate on the cruelty of the measure, and try to move their pity by showing them the mangled and deplorable state in which I was. I was told, in reply, that as much care as possible should be taken not to hurt me in moving, but that go I must. Seeing them resolved, I prepared to comply. A mattress stretched on one of the hatches was placed in the boat, and I was lowered down upon it, and the party who had charge of me, having received orders to be careful and gentle in their usage, shoved off the boat and rowed towards shore. Section 4. Part 4. It was past 2 in the morning before we reached the shore, and landed close to a house, where we found a horse and a man in waiting for us. I was taken into the house, while they formed a sort of a litter for me, with a bed fastened on the animal's back. Upon this I was placed, and the party proceeded about 2 miles and a half, through a forest, to the magistrate's residence. On our arrival at the door, I was taken off the litter, and the first object that met my view was Seraphina, who rushed into my arms, crying, "For God's sake, take me, for they have just killed my father," and burst into tears. The distress in which she was made me conclude that he was dead, and when I was carried into a miserable apartment, meanly furnished, I was met by her mother, to whom Seraphina exclaimed, "Oh, my dear mother, this is the good Englishman come to cure my father." In the room there were only 2 beds and a leather bottomed chair. Upon one of the beds was stretched the magistrate, covered with blood, and on the other the wounded pirate. Being placed by the side of the former, I gave directions to have him stripped, and then proceeded to examine his wound. One ball had slightly fractured his left arm, and passed into the shoulder, and another had lodged in the arm. The latter I easily extracted, and reduced the fracture in the best manner I was able, and bound up the wound. The wife and daughter remained silent but anxious, spectators of my operations, and, when I had concluded, asked me if the old man would survive, to which I gave a favorable answer, and then dressed the wounds of the other sufferer. The house, while I was attending to the wounded man, was thronged with the villagers, part of whom had come from curiosity to see me, and part to inquire after their magistrate. During these operations the pirates who had accompanied me had been absent, but on their return they told me that they had been burying Pepe, one of their comrades, who had been killed in the rencontre. They had with them the 2 prisoners they had taken, bound hand and foot, and beside them, on the ground, were the bleeding corpses of the other 2, mangled in a dreadful manner. One of these they threw across a horse, and taking the 2 prisoners, they proceeded towards the beach, leaving 4 men to take care of me. The prisoners were fastened on each side of the horse to the dead body, and in this manner they marched in triumph through the village without being interfered with. After they were gone, I was removed and placed on a bed in another room, where Seraphina came to me. When I had related to her how I had been reduced to my present miserable situation, I reminded her of her promise, and asked her if her sentiments had undergone any change. She replied, not at all; but while her father's life remained in a state of uncertainty, she could not bear the idea of leaving him, strong as her affection for me was; and besides, she added, in your present state you are unfit to perform so long and so fatiguing a journey. I commended the first reason, and acquiesced in the last, and told her that I should, no doubt, be frequently sent ashore to attend to her father, who was in no real danger, and that a favorable opportunity might offer on one of those visits. I begged her, therefore, if she did really love me, to endeavor and make such preparations that we might be enabled to go at the shortest notice; adding, at the same time, that I had been robbed of all my money, and must depend upon her for finding the means for our journey. "Do not let these considerations make you uneasy," cried she, pressing my hand in the most affectionate manner, and smiling in my face. "I have resolved to accompany you, and will remove every obstacle in the best way I can; but caution is necessary, and therefore you must learn to be patient, and not think me insincere because my movements do not keep pace with your wishes." The horses had now returned from conveying the prisoners, and the men, entering to inform me of their arrival, interrupted our conversation. I bade Seraphina adieu, and, with a light heart, suffered them to carry me to the litter, which was made the same as formerly. Before we set off, the magistrate sent word to beg that I might be allowed to visit him on the following day. The body of the other man was now fastened across one of the horses, and the party proceeded towards the beach. When we arrived at the place where the boat was stationed, the dead body was cut from the horse and flung into the sea. A line was then fastened to the neck and attached to the boat, for the purpose of towing it into deep water, where they intended to sink it, and had brought a stone with them for that purpose. It was at this time broad daylight, and we had scarce rowed 150 yards from the shore, when we perceived a man, closely pursued by the inhabitants, rush towards the shore, plunge into the sea, and swim after the boat. The crew pulled towards him and took him in. On inquiry, he proved to be one of the chief mate's party, and they deliberately told him that he must die, pointing out to him, at the same time, the mangled body of his late associate. The poor wretch, seeing that he had only escaped from one set of barbarians to fall into the hands of a worse, burst into an agony of tears, and implored them to have mercy on him. The inhabitants, in the meantime, demanded with loud cries that he should be delivered up, and the boat returned apparently for that purpose. But, after some altercation, they resolved to keep and murder him themselves, and again left the shore, with the determination to torture him in the swampy passage where they had already destroyed one victim. When they had arrived at the entrance of that pestiferous spot, they sunk the dead body, after inflicting some indignities upon it, and thence proceeded to strip their lately acquired prisoner, whom they lashed on the boat, gagged and pinioned, and pulled into the channel. The body of the miserable being was soon covered with mosquitoes and sand flies, and he writhed with the agony of their stings. In this state they carried him to where a tree projected into the waters, on which they placed him, blindfolded, shot him, and then made the best of their way to the corsair. On their arrival, they exultingly told their companions of their cruelty, not only what I had witnessed, but what they had inflicted on the other two captives whom I had seen bound at the magistrate's residence. These poor wretches they had fastened to trees, and fired at them as targets, and one monster boasted that he had lost a bet of a doubloon because he had not killed his man first. Weak and fatigued as I was from want of rest, I was ordered to attend to the sick on board. The wounded man, I found, was now quite well, and I endeavored to impress upon his mind that he owed his life entirely to my exertions, which he verily believed, for he declared that I should never want a friend while he was on board. Having performed this office, I dressed my own wounds, which I found less painful, and assuming a more favorable aspect. The captain came in and examined them, and expressed a hope that I should soon be able to make the sail and go up aloft, which I told him I should be able to do in 3 or 4 days. He then questioned me on the subject of the magistrate's disaster, and told me that I must pay every possible attention to him, as he was a very worthy man, and his best friend. In order to lull his suspicions, I pretended unwillingness to go so frequently ashore, and recommended him to send for a medical man; but he overruled my objections, and said that he was quite confident in my skill. On this day he was perfectly sober, which was seldom the case, and he began to display a feeling of kindness towards me, remarked I must be fatigued, and recommended me to take a few hours' sleep, a recommendation that I willingly followed, and slept till I was called up to dinner. After dinner I tried to continue making the sail, with which he was highly pleased. I worked at it till near 9 in the evening, when he told me that I had done enough, and had better go to bed. At 5 o'clock on the following morning I resumed my labors, and by breakfast time had got the whole put together. After breakfast I attended to the sick, as usual, and in the meantime the sail was hoisted up by the captain's desire to see whether it would answer, and he expressed himself highly pleased with it. In the afternoon I was to visit the magistrate, but another event prevented me. About 11 in the forenoon there was a cry of a sail, and notwithstanding my wounds I was ordered aloft to look out and examine. With great torture and much difficulty I reached my post, and discovered a ship close hauled, standing towards land, with her larboard tacks aboard, and having the appearance of a merchantman. The moment I gave this information, the schooner was got under way, and proceeded in chase. The motion of the vessel now became extremely painful to me, and I came down on deck, which the captain no sooner perceived than he rushed up to me and beat me over the head and shoulders with the flat part of a cutlass, exclaiming, "When I was on board an English man of war, if I had come down without orders, I should have got 6 dozen lashes. And I will serve you as your countrymen served me." I was then forced up aloft a second time, and might have suffered harsher usage but for the interference of some of the officers, who interposed between us. In a few minutes the ruffian followed me up, and told me to examine and tell him what vessel she was. I endeavored to do so, as well as I could, and told him that it was a Dutch vessel, which he imparted to his crew, who gave 3 cheers. He himself was highly pleased at the intelligence, called me a good fellow, expressed his sorrow for maltreating me, and said the Dutch vessels were good prizes, as they always carried specie to purchase their cargo. I thought this a good opportunity to get released from my painful situation, and asked his leave to go down on deck, which he granted me. The Dutchman appeared suspicious of the corsair, and now endeavored to bear away, but it was too late, for the pirate sailed very fast and was nearly up to him. To decoy them, English colors were run up and a gun fired, upon which they hauled up their mainsail and tacked towards the corsair. The captain suspected that they meant to resist, and therefore hauled his wind until the Dutchman was within reach of the long gun, which he fired at him, pulling down the English colors, and running up the red flag at the same time. The shot struck close under his bows, and he instantly laid aback the main topsail. When we were within hail, I was ordered to hail her in English, and desire the captain to bring his papers on board. The Dutchman was rather slow in obeying the order, and a volley of musketry was fired over their heads, which quickened their movements. When they came on board they exhibited symptoms of the greatest terror, and their papers were taken from them and given to me to examine. It was in vain for me to plead ignorance of their language, as I was compelled to know everything. I therefore pretended to read them, and attempted to guess at their contents. The captain of the Dutchman was, in the meantime, interrogated as to what money he had on board, and the same threat held out to him that had been held out to the master of the Zephyr. The pirate then went on board the prize, with a pilot and 4 of his crew, leaving the Dutch captain a prisoner on board the schooner, and immediately on his arrival they made sail, and both vessels steered for the harbor, but were prevented by the current from beating into the channel, and anchored without the reef for the night. 2 carronades were then taken out of her and brought on board the corsair, and the captain was ordered to go to his ship, where the pirate wanted him. I was compelled to accompany him in the boat, and, as we approached, one of the pirates on board threw a Dutch sailor into the sea. We picked up the poor wretch, and the Dutch captain put some question to him, at the reply to which they all gave a dismal groan, and exhibited the greatest terror and distress. When we reached the ship, the captain was ordered on deck first, which he no sooner reached than he was knocked down and threatened with destruction if he did not reveal where the money was concealed, and the most dreadful threats made because he denied that there was any. I was then appealed to and asked if I thought there was any. I answered in the negative. This seemed to pacify the pirate, who, however, said that he would detain the vessel and discharge the cargo, consisting of gin, butter, cheese, and bales of canvas, and then burn her; and, with the most horrid imprecations, threatened the whole crew with death if he found money afterwards. The mate of the vessel had, during the pirate's stay on board, denied all knowledge of the English language, and had, no doubt, by that artifice, escaped very many awkward questions. Of this circumstance, however, I was not aware, and addressed some questions to him, which he unwittingly answered me. His replies were overheard by the captain, who, always alive to suspicions, now suspected that he had had some object in view in concealing his knowledge of our language. I endeavored to protect the poor fellow, as I had been the cause of his detection, by saying that he spoke so badly that I could scarcely understand him, and that, therefore, he had only spoken the truth. My interferences saved his life, but did not secure him from blows of which he received his share. The suspicions of the pirate had, however, been roused, and nothing could persuade him but that the whole of the crew understood English more or less. In consequence of this unfortunate circumstance, the ship's cook underwent a great deal of rough usage and ill treatment, because he could not answer in English to some questions which were put to him, and which the captain, who was drunk, insisted should be answered in that language. At dusk I was sent on board the Corsair for the night, which passed without any remarkable occurrence. At 4 in the morning the vessels weighed anchor, and went to the mouth of the channel, where they again brought to, and waited for the sea breeze, as they could not enter without a leading wind. At 10 o'clock the sea breeze blew rather fresh, and they entered the harbor, where the Corsair was brought to an anchor, and the Dutch ship run on shore. A boat was then dispatched for me, and on my arrival, the captain, who had passed the night on board, desired me to go below and dress the wounds of one of the pirates whom he had punished for insolence during the night. When I went, I found the man had received a very severe cut with a sword on the side of the head, the wound extending from the left temple to the ear. When I had cleaned and dressed the wound, the fellow seemed very grateful for my attention, and said that when he was well he would assist me to escape, but I was too fearful of treachery to intimate a wish to that effect to him. After dinner I was sent ashore to the magistrate, but, on our way thither, became an unwilling participant in an unexpected rencontre. As our boat was approaching the entrance of the narrow passage, which I have had occasion to mention before, we perceived another with 6 men rowing rapidly towards us from the shore. Our first idea was that it was a man of war's boat, and the pirates made immediate preparation for defence, being apparently determined to sell their lives very dearly, consulting me upon what mode of fighting they should adopt, and insisting upon my being their leader. One of the men, however, recognized the chief mate as one of the party, and from their movements it appeared they were going to attack us. Knowing that indiscriminate slaughter would ensue, and that I should suffer the same as the rest, I consented to direct them how to defend their boat, and while considering on the best means of doing so, a musket was fired across our bows, and signals made for us to go to them. No time was to be lost, so I desired 2 of the men to lie down in the boat with their blunderbusses, and the other 2 to keep at the oars, having theirs ready by them to use at a preconcerted signal. Then taking the helm in my hand, guided the boat direct upon the others. When I found that the boat had sufficient way upon her, I desired the rowers to desist and take their weapons, and be ready to jump into the other with their cutlasses the instant that they had discharged their pieces. My instructions were fully obeyed, and the result was in our favor. The suddenness of our attack completely disconcerted them. 3 of them fell by our fire. The rest made but a feeble resistance, 2 of whom were instantly massacred by the pirates, and the other leaped into the sea, wounded as he was, and endeavored to swim off, but was followed and taken. We only lost 1 man, who received a ball in the head, and instantly expired. The unfortunate prisoner was interrogated as to the cause that had induced him to join the chief mate in his designs. He replied that he had left the Havana with no other view than to join the pirate, but having heard on shore of the unprovoked slaughter of their associates, they had determined to be revenged. When they observed the corsair bring in her prize, they knew that there would be frequent communications with the shore, and resolved to cut off the boats seriatim as fast as they were sent. He then declared that he had told them the truth, and hoped, that as he was not the instigator of the deed, they would be satisfied with having taken the lives of his companions and spare his own. But the appeal was made in vain, for he was almost instantaneously stabbed to the heart by one of the crew. Thus did I become the unwilling actor in a scene of blood, and assist, by my advice, in the destruction of 6 of my fellow creatures. I did then, and do now, often reflect upon it with horror, but I had no alternative, and must have been massacred myself had I not complied with the mandates of the ferocious wretches among whom it was the misfortune of my life to be thrown. On our arrival on shore, a hole was dug, and the murdered man buried. I was then placed upon a litter, as before, and taken to the magistrate's house. Seraphina and her mother met me at the door, and seemed rejoiced to see me, particularly the former. I found the old man in a very favorable state, and having dressed his wounds, and informed his wife and daughter that there was no danger to be apprehended, retired to another room, where Seraphina joined me. To my inquiries, she told me that she had made preparations for our departure, and had engaged a guide, who had undertaken to conduct us for $100, and that in 8 or 10 days we should be able to proceed. She was in raptures at the prospect of going to England, but not more so than myself. The prize master had been instructed to remain as short a time as possible on shore, and seeing that I had performed the service upon which I had been sent, informed me he was waiting for me. I begged a short delay, which he, with much and evidently sincere regret, denied his ability to grant, and I was consequently compelled to take an unwilling leave of my fair consoler. No accident befell us on our return, and as soon as we had arrived, the whole affair of our rencontre was detailed to the captain, who had been alarmed at the firing, and the success of it entirely attributed to the advice and skill of the Englishman. The captain appeared displeased when we first came on board, but this intelligence pleased him, and he told me that he had intended to punish me very severely for having told the Dutchman that he was a pirate; but on account of the services which I had rendered his boat's crew, he should forgive me and look it over, yet, if ever I did so again, nothing should save me. I now advanced more and more in the pirate's confidence, and hoped that this would at some time be favorable to my intended attempt to escape. 2 small coasting schooners, which the captain had seized for the purpose, were at this time receiving the prize's cargo on board, to convey to the Havana for sale, and I was ordered to go and take account of it, as well as to superintend the unlading, and make the Dutch sailors work. By 2 o'clock in the morning, until which time they kept constantly at work, the lading of the schooners was completed, and I returned on board to sleep. The following morning was a dead calm, and the sails of the Dutch ship were all unbent, and her top gallant masts sent down over deck. About 9 o'clock a breeze sprung up from the east, and soon after a large schooner hove in sight. I was ordered to the mast head, as usual, to examine her, and reported her to be a large coasting schooner, very full of men. The whole of the Dutch vessel's crew were then ordered on board, with the exception of the captain, cook, the carpenter, who was lame, and the little boy. Several guns were brought up out of the hold, and the ship prepared for action. The captain then went aloft himself, and soon discovered the schooner to be an old acquaintance, a fellow pirate. He, however, suspected the peaceful disposition of the approaching corsair, and asked me, in case of attack, whether it would be prudent for him to remain at anchor. I answered in the negative, and the vessel was got under way, and the Dutchmen informed that they would be expected to take an active share in the engagement. They remonstrated, and some even cried at the mandate, but this only produced blows, and they were obliged to take their station at the guns. The schooner, having hove to in a wide passage through which the stranger was to pass, awaited her arrival. As she drew near, we perceived a white flag at the mast head as an amicable signal, which was answered by the red flag at the foretop mast head, and a Spanish ensign at the peak, upon which the other hoisted out and dispatched a boat with 5 men. When about musket shot from us, they paused as if in doubt, and the helmsman waved a white flag, to which the captain replied with a white handkerchief, and beckoned him on board. The boats then came alongside, the 2 captains recognized each other, and the stranger smiled at our warlike preparations. Both vessels then stood into the harbor and came to anchor, and were no sooner moored than the officers of the other came on board the corsair, and were well entertained. Before they proceeded to carouse, the captain informed me I must go on shore to the magistrate, and take with me such medicines as I thought he might require for the next 4 or 5 days, as he should convoy the 2 small schooners with the Dutchman's cargo on their way to the Havana, and should not return for that time. I willingly obeyed this order, and was conveyed in the usual manner on shore, and from thence to the village. After dressing the old man's wounds, I had an interview, as usual, with Seraphina. I informed her of the probability of my being absent for some days, and begged her to expedite the preparations for our departure in the meantime. She was proceeding to assure me of her willingness to do everything in her power, when a hasty messenger arrived, and brought orders for my instant return to the corsair, in consequence of an alarming accident on board. When I arrived, I found that the whole party had got extremely intoxicated, and the cry of a sail being made, the captain of the stranger had gone up into the rigging of his own ship to look out, and, having lost his hold, had fallen on deck, and was much bruised. He seemed dreadfully alarmed, but I pacified him, telling him that there was no danger, and, having bled him, put him to bed. He was very grateful for what I did, and offered to exert his interest for my release. As I knew the application would be fruitless, and might lead to ill treatment, I declined it. He then offered me money, which I also refused. The corsair now came to visit him, and the other begged I might be allowed to remain with him for this cruise, until he was recovered, pledging his word to bring me safe back. But the other refused, on the plea that he could not spare me. After we had supped, the captain returned to his own vessel, taking me with him. Although during the day they had been upon the most friendly terms, and the stranger had received large presents of cheese, gin, butter, and even sails and spars, and almost everything he might have deemed necessary, yet so suspicious was the pirate of the other, having some sinister design upon him, that he took every precautionary measure in his power. Springs were put on his cable, the watch was doubled, the guns loaded, and the men ordered to lie with their arms upon the deck, which was cleared as if for immediate action. Whether it was, that the other had really had any hostile designs upon the corsair, and was prevented from putting them into execution by the activity and watchfulness of his rival, or that the suspicions of the captain were unjust or ill founded, I do not know, but both parties remained tranquil for the night, although both appeared to be on their guard. Section 5, Part 5. In the morning I visited my new patient in the other vessel, who very carefully offered to do all he could in his power for me. The captain arrived soon after, having been sent for by him, and I was very warmly recommended to his good graces. Both vessels in a short time began to prepare for their respective cruises, and the 2 pirates now took leave of one another, and the captain and myself returned on board our own schooner. After having left 4 of the crew as a guard in the prize, her own crew being on board the corsair, the pirate proceeded on his voyage to the Havana, accompanied by the 2 small schooners. All 3 stood up within the reef till the afternoon, when we discovered a small schooner rigged vessel, very full of men, coming down towards us. As she was too insignificant to cause any apprehension, the captain kept on his course until within gunshot, and fired to bring her to. A boat was then dispatched on board with 10 of the Dutchmen armed, with orders to search for arms and ammunition, but on no account to injure the people on board of her. In boarding her, the Dutchmen drew their swords, which so alarmed some of the Spaniards that they jumped overboard, at which the captain, who was watching them with a glass, laughed most heartily, pointing them out to me. He had the humanity, however, to dispatch another boat to their assistance, and the prize master, who went on this last service, informed us, when he returned, that he knew most of the people on board, who were inhabitants of some of the villages along the coast. At dusk the convoy anchored for the night, and at daybreak again pursued their voyage. We had proceeded but a very little way when we perceived a large schooner on the outer edge of the reef, and I was sent to my usual post on such occasions to reconnoitre. She proved to be a merchantman, and, as the wind was light, sweeps were got out to go in chase of her. We were approaching her very fast when we observed that she had dispatched a small canoe with 3 men towards the shore. The captain no sooner perceived this than he manned and dispatched a boat in pursuit, as he conjectured that they had specie on board. Having taken this measure, he hoisted the red flag, and fired a gun at the schooner to bring her to. She immediately wore round, and hoisted Spanish colors, which made the pirate believe she would engage him. He cleared the vessel for action accordingly, and fired a second shot with intent to strike her, but it fell short, though well directed. The stranger now hauled down her colors and hove to, and the pirate hailed and ordered the captain on board with his papers. On his arrival on board they recognized one another as old friends, and when the pirate asked him what had induced him to dispatch his canoe ashore, he found by the reply that his conjecture had been true. The stranger had taken him for a Carthaginian privateer, and had sent what little money he had on board away. The boat in the meantime had gained upon the canoe, and having fired, wantonly too, a volley of musketry at her, had compelled the rowers to stop, but no mischief fortunately had ensued. After an interchange of civilities, the captain of the stranger returned, taking with him 2 cases of gin and half a dozen cheeses as a present. At night we anchored in a small bay, called by the Spaniards Morilla, about 2 leagues southwest of the Bay of Honda. As there were several piratical row boats that frequently capture small vessels and infested the latter place, the pirate did not think his convoy out of danger until they had passed it, and therefore accompanied them thus far, and then, giving them in charge of the prize master, returned towards the harbor, which we reached on the following evening. On his arrival there, he ran the corsair alongside the Dutch prize, and having taken out her guns and stores, had her hove down to repair some trifling damage done to her coppering, upon which the Dutch carpenter and the one belonging to the pirate were jointly employed. On the following afternoon, while they were thus occupied, and the corsair was defenceless, an American sloop of war hove in sight and stood close along the outer edge of the reef. I felt confident that she would send in her boats to attack the pirates, and trembled between hope and fear. Hope, because that event might procure me my liberty, and fear, lest being found among this horde of miscreants, my tale should be disbelieved, and myself confounded with them, and subjected to the same ignominious and disgraceful end. That she could not see the pirates and distinctly discern all their movements, I will never believe, for I could plainly perceive her men and officers walking the deck. Nay, so apprehensive were the pirates that they would be attacked, that they all gathered round and entreated the captain to right the schooner and take measures of defence. The captain, however, appeared to know his man, and to hold him in thorough contempt. "When I see them hoist out their boats," cried he, "I will believe they are in earnest, but the Americans always boast more than they perform, and they will not attempt to attack us. Were they English, I should be afraid." His conclusions were just, for the American took no notice whatever, and very quietly pursued his way. With them ceased my hopes and my apprehensions, but Seraphina appeared to me in the shape of my delivering angel. In the course of the afternoon I went on shore to visit her father, whom I found much better, and, having discharged my duty towards him, had my usual interview with my fair and amiable friend. Her eyes and her countenance beamed love and joy when she entered the room, and I immediately perceived that she had some welcome intelligence to communicate. "I have arranged all," cried she passionately, throwing herself into my arms. "The guide is in readiness, and it only remains for us to fix the time and find the opportunity." I clasped the dear lovely creature in my arms. I was too agitated to speak, and, while I held her to my heart, shed over her tears of joy and gratitude. She was the first who recovered her self possession, and, blushing to find herself in that situation, gently disengaged herself from my arms, and advised me to be on my guard and not let any one see my emotion. "Do not be so agitated," cried she. "The time is short, and we have much to think of, therefore let us make the most of it to render our plans effective." After many schemes had been proposed and rejected by turns, it was agreed that I should come over late on the second evening, under pretence of performing some surgical operation on her father; that she would in the meantime have the horses and guide in waiting at a short distance, and take every precaution to prevent a discovery. Our conversation was now interrupted by the entrance of several villagers, who, having heard of my cures, had come to me for medical advice. As I was cautious of giving umbrage to the captain, I declined giving any advice without his consent, and, to avoid importunity, told the prize master, who always accompanied me as a guard, that I was ready to return on board the schooner. On our arrival at the vessel we found a boat alongside, belonging to the magistrate of a village about 10 miles off, who had sent to beg some gin, cheese, and other articles from the pirate. Anxious to keep on good terms at all times with these authorities, the boat was laden with presents and sent back. Can it be a matter of surprise that these miscreants have committed their lawless depredations for so long a time, and with such impunity, when the very men whose duty it was to extirpate them were daily encouraging them; when the pirate could boast that the magistrate was his friend, and receive in the face of all the laws of his country and of nations such proofs of his friendship as to be enabled to thwart all hostile measures adopted against him? European nations may send out their crusades against them, but while the execution of the laws is placed in such hands, while pirates plunder and the magistrates and his myrmidons share, all their efforts will be vain, and, like the hydra, when they destroy one head, a fresh one will supply its place. The night passed without any particular occurrence, and in the morning the American sloop of war again hove in sight. The corsair's repairs had been completed the preceding day, and she had been righted. The captain, therefore, out of bravado, said, "As the Yankee will not come to me, I will go to him." I certainly expected that the experiment would cost him dear, but of his real object I was not aware until we had got without the reef. Having attracted the attention of the American and induced him to chase the corsair, he ran into an intricate channel with the hopes of destroying him on the rocks. This he could do with impunity, as the pilots were well acquainted with every part of the reef. He made the experiment 3 or 4 times, but the American was too wary, and perceived his object. I thought at least that after this he would send in his boats; but no, he took no further notice of him, and stood quietly on, although the pirate had actually fired at him and insulted his flag. In the evening I finished the sail which I had commenced some time before, at which I worked till bedtime, and then stretched myself on my mattress in anxious expectation of the day that was to restore me to liberty and deliver me from the hands of these miscreants. The greatest part of the night was passed in sleepless agitation, between hope and fear, weighing in my mind every obstacle that might arise to oppose my escape, and the means to obviate them. Towards morning I sunk into a profound sleep, from which I did not wake till called to visit the sick. The wished for and important moment was now fast approaching, and I told the pirate that I should want to go on shore, to perform some necessary operations upon the magistrate. After some trifling questions, leave was granted, and at 5 in the evening, with a beating heart, I descended the corsair's side, as I hoped, for the last time. On our arrival at the house I found my reception unusually cold and formal. The mother looked at me with an air of anger and distrust, and Seraphina stood behind her, pale, and her cheeks bathed in tears. The moment she caught my eye she made a signal to me to be silent, and in the most anxious agitation I passed into the sick man's chamber. "Well, sir," said he, "I have detected you in your base and nefarious plans." My presence of mind did not forsake me. I pretended not to understand him, and, with an assumed appearance of alarm and surprise, exclaimed, "Good sir, I hope you are not delirious. I hope your wound has not taken an unfavorable turn," and, taking him by the pulse, immediately pulled out a lancet, saying I must bleed him, as he was in a high fever. The coolness and presence of mind with which I uttered this completely staggered him, and he actually seemed to believe himself to be delirious, and that all was the effect of a disordered mind. He then asked me if I had made such proposals to his daughter. "Sir," I replied, with my former coolness, "your suspicions are an insult to your daughter, for had I been bold and villainous enough to have made such a proposal, she would have rejected it with contempt, and been the first to have informed you of it." Seraphina, who had been listening, now entered the room, and he addressed himself to her; and she boldly, and with an indignant air, denied the accusation. "What!" exclaimed the astonished father, "did not the very guide you hired inform me?" "Sir," replied she, bursting into tears, "that guide, as you call him, is a base and infamous wretch, and I will no longer screen him from your displeasure. He met me in the forest the other day, and took some very indecent liberties with me, and because I threatened to make it known to you, declared he would tell you that I wanted to elope with the Englishman. That I highly esteem him I do not deny, and it would be ungrateful if I did not, after he has saved your life." Here she sobbed loudly, and the old magistrate so completely believed her, that the mother was called in, and all matters amicably settled, the old man vowing vengeance against the rascally guide. The report of my intended escape had, however, transpired, and, as my not performing any operation on the magistrate might give a color to it, I thought proper to bleed him, telling him that his blood was in a bad state and required it. Seraphina took an opportunity of informing me that the guide she had engaged had insisted upon having $50 in advance, and having paid it him, he had no sooner received the money than he basely betrayed her secret. She told me, however, that she would endeavor to obtain a more faithful one, and in the meantime begged I would place the utmost reliance on her exertions and on her discretion. She had now given such proofs of her sincerity, as well as of her firmness, that I did not doubt her; and although I left her disappointed, still I was not hopeless. I saw that my attendants were grown excessively suspicious of me, and watched my motions closely, but I took no notice of it, and proceeded as usual to the boat. One thing, however, threw a gloom over my mind. The captain had declared that when my services were no longer wanted, he would kill me, as it would be dangerous to let me escape now I had obtained a knowledge of the reefs, for I should lead the English men of war there. This proposal had been rejected by the prize master and some of the crew, whose good will I had gained. This intelligence I had received in confidence from the cook, and I now dreaded that this report would afford a pretext for my murder. The captain's behavior, however, was different from what I expected. At first he was violent, but on my repeating Seraphina's statement to the magistrate, and the prize master confirming mine of having bled the old man, he became pacified, but declared that the magistrate must come to me for the future. He then ordered me to go below to bed. On the following day, the crew were chiefly employed in lading boats sent by the priests and magistrates of the different villages, with gin, cheeses, and other presents, and nothing of consequence occurred. On the day after, the other prize master returned from the Havana with a merchant schooner, the owner of which was come to purchase the remainder of the Dutchman's cargo. The assassin who had been dispatched to murder Mr. Lumsden returned on board of her, and reported that his intended victim had sailed some time before his arrival. The schooner was loaded in the course of that day, and on my making up the account of the purchase, the captain desired me to tell the crew that the amount was $800 less than it really was, with a threat to murder me if I betrayed the secret. On the following morning, the schooner having completed her cargo, sailed for the Havana, and was convoyed by the pirate as far as the Morilla, when he left her to proceed by herself, and anchored in the bay. On that afternoon, the third mate of the corsair left the vessel to proceed over land on a party of pleasure, and was to stop for that evening at a small village called Cavancas. I have reason to believe, however, that it was something more than a mere party of pleasure that had taken him to the Havana. The succeeding day presented another scene of atrocity and murder. In the morning, while at anchor, a sail was discovered in the offing, and, in order to alter the sailing of the schooner, the crew were employed in removing some of the ballast more aft. In this place the French cook of the Dutch prize was placed for security, as, since his capture, the ill treatment which he had undergone and terror combined had affected his mind, and he had shown evident symptoms of insanity. The inhuman wretches teased the poor maniac until they made him rave, and in his frenzy he caught hold of a hatchet and wounded one of his tormentors. The blow was no sooner given than the rest plunged their knives into his body, and threw him overboard while yet breathing, accompanying their barbarity with most horrid expressions. I was on the top during this scene, but was called down to dress the wounded man. Having performed this task, I returned to my station, but the morning was hazy, and it was long before I could obtain a distinct view of the stranger. The captain, however, had been up, and ascertained her to be an English brig with full quarters and a white streak. The vessel was then got under way, and the deck cleared for action. While this was doing, the gunner informed him that there were not cartridges enough made up for a long action, should she resist, and the novel task was assigned to me to assist in making more. While thus employed, another vessel was seen, and I was called up to look at her. She also proved to be an English brig. The vessel of which we were in chase, however, still continued her course, and took no notice of the corsair, although several guns had been fired and American colors hoisted. The captain was furious, and ordered another gun to be fired, of which she took no notice. The wind was light, and sweeps were then ordered out to gain upon her. As we approached, the long gun was shotted and fired, which produced the desired effect, and the brig brought to. The American colors were then hauled down, and the red flag hoisted, and the boat let down to board her. 6 armed men were ordered into her for that purpose, and myself and a pilot directed to accompany them. I wished to avoid this unpleasant duty, but, on appearing to hesitate, I was threatened with a repetition of the cruelties I had already undergone. With a bursting heart I complied, and was enjoined, with the most dreadful threats, to hold no communication with the captain or crew, while the pilot was directed to throw the former overboard, and, when he had tacked the brig toward shore, to send me back. On our way I prevailed upon the pilot, with whom I had some influence, to disobey the dreadful mandate. When we reached her, we were met by the captain of the brig at the gangway, who asked us who and what we were, to which I was obliged to give an evasive answer by saying that the corsair was a privateer. After we had been on board the brig a short time, and had tacked her towards the shore, a musket was fired from the corsair, and I was desired by the pilot to tell the captain and his crew to go into the boat, and go on board the pirate. The captain, who had been regarding me steadfastly for some time, now claimed acquaintance with me. His face appeared familiar to me, I must confess, but his name I did not know, and, being well aware that all my motions were watched, I deemed it most prudent, for the present, to plead ignorance. Fearful that the pirate's boat would be too crowded, I recommended the captain to lower his own boat, but he declined, saying it was leaky and not in a condition to go on the water. We then left the brig, the captain expressing a wish that he should not be long detained, and still apparently ignorant of the schooner being a pirate; to which I replied I could not answer, as the captain was angry with him for having given so much trouble. On our reaching the corsair's deck, the pirate, in a rough tone, asked him his name, and he replied, "Cook." I then recognized him as a casual acquaintance. From the fury in which I saw the pirate, I anticipated the most serious consequences to the poor fellow, and, in order to save him if possible, claimed relationship, and told him he was my cousin, and that, therefore, for my sake, and in consideration of the services that I had done for him, he would not maltreat Captain Cook. For once I prevailed over his brutal disposition, and he promised not to do so if the other told him the whole truth as to what money he had, and what was his cargo. The bills of lading were then handed to me, and I informed him that it consisted of rum only. Having been informed by Captain Cook that the vessel in sight was either a transport with troops, or the brig Victoria from Black River, Jamaica, I was sent up to examine, and from her appearance pronounced her to be the transport. Captain Cook was, however, ordered to look at her, and he, being better acquainted with the vessel, said it was the Victoria, and chase was given immediately; much, however, against the will of the crew, who were afraid of her being the transport. The crew of the Industry, the vessel he had just captured, were ordered to the guns, in case of an engagement, and the corsair, for the breeze had now freshened, fast approached her chase. Notwithstanding the promise he had made, the pirate still exhibited an inclination to vent his fury on Captain Cook, and I was occasionally obliged to interfere to save him from its effects. I have been told, since my arrival in this country, that Captain Cook has declared and boasted that he resisted the pirate, and did not quit his vessel until a round shot had been fired between his masts, and a volley of musketry on his deck. I am willing to give him every credit for his anxiety to save his vessel, and am ready to acknowledge that he did all that an unfortunate man in his situation could do; but I must deny the truth of his assertions on this point. The shot that was fired was across the bow of the Industry, and fell short by more than 100 yards, and as to musketry, with the solitary exception of the signal to the captain and crew on board, none was discharged. As for resistance, none whatever was made, and for a good reason. It was out of his power to make any. The corsair, being a very rapid sailer, soon came within range of the Victoria, and the long gun was fired athwart her bows, which she answered by hoisting her colors and breaking her main yard. A pilot, for we had several, was then ordered to repair on board, accompanied by me, with directions to send the brig's officers and part of her crew on board. Our arrival was a signal for a repetition of the same brutal act towards the unfortunate crew of this vessel that had been exercised towards those of the other, and the officers and some of the men were driven into the boat. The sails were then filled, and the brig steered after the corsair, who was now returning towards the coast in the direction of Cape Blanco. Soon after this, the atmosphere became dense and hazy, and it began to rain, and we were suddenly thrown into great alarm by the appearance of a strange schooner, who seemed to chase us. The man who was at first at the wheel had been changed, and his successor was not so good a steersman. As the wind was abaft the beam, We set steering sails by the pilot's direction, to get away from the stranger, but the man steered so badly that the pirate began to be apprehensive of capture, and rated him for his awkwardness. The furious gesticulations of the Spaniard only confused the poor fellow, and made him steer worse. This added fuel to fire, and he began to suspect it was I that was making him do so, to enable the schooner to overtake us. He then turned upon me, and told me that if I did not make him steer more steadily, he would take his knife and kill him. I knew that to threaten with these wretches was to perform. In order, therefore, to save the man's life, I pretended to be enraged with him, and struck him lightly across the back with the flat part of a cutlass. This act, though done with the best and purest of motives, and from a desire to save the life of a fellow creature, has since been adduced against me as a proof that I joined in the brutalities of these blood-stained miscreants, and took a delight in them. Such is the gratitude that man has to expect from his fellow man. Section 6, Part 6. It was now late in the day. The rain had ceased, and the atmosphere had become more clear, and with it our apprehensions had vanished. For we could perceive that the stranger was no man of war, nor was she in pursuit of us, but standing a different course. I began to wish that night would come on, for I had resolved in my own mind to attempt my escape under cover of the darkness, to kill the pilot and the other Spaniard, for only 2 were on board, and take the vessel to New Orleans. This I hoped to accomplish, as I counted upon the assistance of the 2 men who had been left on board. The pirate, however, was too guarded, for at dusk the gunner of the corsair was sent on board, and I was taken back. The prisoners on board were ordered down into the hold, with the exception of the steward of the Industry, who was sent into the cabin. Sentries were then placed over the hatchways, and the prisoners charged, on the peril of their lives, not to come upon deck. All 3 vessels came to an anchor close by each other outside the reef, and as soon as the necessary arrangements were made for their safety, a council was held to deliberate on the disposal of the prisoners. Some question having arisen, I was sent for to inform them what quantity of coffee was in the Victoria, and how much rum on board the Industry, with the relative value of each. On being informed, the captain declared the rum not worth their attention, and talked of destroying the latter vessel. I remained to hear the result of their deliberations, anxious for the safety of the unfortunate wretches who, like myself, had fallen into their hands. The debate was warm. Part wished to put them to death and throw them overboard, and part, more merciful, wished that the Industry might be suffered to proceed, and take them with her. I joined my entreaties to this effect, and, after much altercation, the latter alternative was chosen, much to the dissatisfaction of the more sanguinary party. The sentinels prevented any communication with the English prisoners, so that I could not inform them of their fate. I was then ordered below, and the captain left the corsair to visit the 2 brigs, leaving her in charge of the prize master. On his return, he told me that he should grant my request, and give up the Industry, and then gave orders to the prize master to that effect, giving strict injunctions, however, to detain the clothes of both the crews. He then went on shore, as he said, to overtake the 3rd mate at the Cavagnas, and to give him instructions to send vessels down from the Havana, with bags for the purpose of sending the Victoria's coffee to market. I dreaded much that the captain's absence would be the cause of the ill treatment, if not of the murder of the prisoners on board, nor were my fears without foundation. One of the fiends, who had wished to put them to death, now proposed to carry the diabolical plan into immediate execution, but was opposed by the prize master in charge. Deeming him the only obstacle, he watched his opportunity, and while he was reclining against one of the guns, made an attempt to despatch him with his knife. The blow, fortunately for us all, failed, and the cries of his intended victim roused the crew to his assistance, who inflicted summary justice on the bloodthirsty miscreant, and in their fury put him instantly to death. This attempt so alarmed me that I kept awake the remainder of the night, as also did the Industry's steward, who was in the cabin with me. We drew as close together as we dared, and conversed in low whispers during the night, ceasing, however, when we heard any one approach; and I took that opportunity of communicating my unfortunate situation, and what I had suffered since I had been a prisoner, with which he seemed much affected, and sincerely pitied my case. In the morning, the crew of both vessels, with the exception of Captain Hearn, his mate, a passenger, and the Industry's steward, were employed in getting the Victoria under way. Seeing Captain Hearn upon deck, I obtained leave of the prize master to address him. I then informed him of my unfortunate situation, and told him that I should escape the first favorable opportunity. At his request, I obtained his coffee certificates for him from the prize master, but could not succeed in obtaining the restoration of any part of their clothes, which the pirates were resolved to keep. Between one and the other, I was often placed in an awkward dilemma. If I applied for the restoration of any part of the plunder, the pirates became exasperated, and I incurred the risk of ill treatment. If, on the other hand, for the sake of my personal safety, I declined any interference, I was immediately charged with a want of feeling, and the motives misrepresented. That such has been the case, I have had good reason to know, and the prejudices which these misrepresentations excited were nearly fatal to me on a recent occasion. The Corsair and the Victoria were now under way, and the prisoners, except the Dutchman, having performed the task assigned to them, had been transferred on board the Industry. The prize master, therefore, desired me to hail Captain Cook, and to tell him that he was at liberty to pursue his voyage. Although it was in a great measure owing to my interference, and that too at the risk of my own life and personal safety, that the lives of himself and the rest had been spared, and his vessel given back to him, yet since my return to this country, when I was standing on peril of my life, this man did not show the common feelings of gratitude. I received even more kindness from the pirates themselves, brutes as they were, than from this man. Not content with misrepresentations and misstatements, willful and premeditated, he has even had the audacity to invent most atrocious falsehoods in order to poison the minds of those whose duty it was to sit in judgment upon me. The Corsair and her prize stood along the reef towards Rio Omedia, but as the former was the fastest sailer, she soon shot ahead, and the other was left to come up after her. In the afternoon another English vessel hove in sight, but as she was too far in the offing to come up with her before dark, the pirates would not go in chase, but continued on their course to the harbor, where she arrived in the evening, and let go her anchor near their former prize. As the Victoria was not expected till the morning, in consequence of her heavy sailing, no anxiety was felt on her account during the night, but her non-appearance in the morning excited surprise as well as fear, and conjecture was busy deciding on her fate. A messenger, in the meantime, arrived from the magistrate for me, but the prize master replied that the captain had forbidden my going on shore. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon the Corsair's boat, containing the men that had been left in charge of the Victoria, was seen coming towards us, and it was then imagined that she had been recaptured, and that they had therefore abandoned her. On inquiry, however, it appeared that they had taken the vessel we had seen the day before for a ship of war, and, fearful of the consequences, had run the Victoria on the reef, and, having abandoned her, left the Dutchman on board to be retaken. This act of cowardice highly exasperated the pirates on board, who rated them severely, and would have returned in the Corsair to the spot, had not the captain been hourly expected. During the confusion excited by this event, the old magistrate arrived, and was received with due honors by the prize master. He descended into the cabin to have his wound dressed, and while I was so employed, informed me that he had taken measures to have the man punished who had circulated the scandalous report about his daughter and myself. After apologizing for his conduct on that occasion, he informed me that he should pay me a visit shortly, accompanied by Serafina. He then returned on shore, taking with him presents of gin and cheeses. About midnight, the pirates were thrown into an alarm by the arrival of a boat, which proved to be the Dutchman, who had been driven out of the Victoria by fishermen, who came to plunder her. A boat with 8 armed men was immediately dispatched to protect the prize, but she had already been plundered of 8 tierces of coffee. I have been informed that Captain Hearn and his crew were put on board a man of war by the Industry a few days after her release. If so, why was not search made after the pirates and their prizes, and the latter recaptured? For 7 days she remained not 5 leagues from the place where she was captured, and, what is still more important, on the exterior edge of the reef and exposed to view. Perhaps it was anticipated that the pirates had plundered her of her cargo, and that therefore the salvage would not have been sufficient to repay them for their trouble. Is not this a very strong proof of the gross and culpable negligence of the admiral and officers upon that station? Ships of war, forsooth, could be found at all times, and ready at a very short notice to convey specie, and when so employed would make direct voyage and pay no attention to that duty upon which they had been sent, the protection of mercantile property. Well might the merchants and the underwriters complain, but of what avail were those complaints when such open and glaring dereliction of duty was daily and hourly committed, and glossed over by the lords of the admiralty, instead of being inquired into and severely punished? Pirate interest was, however, considered of more importance, and the public commerce, the trade of the country, appeared as nothing when put in competition with it. How many lives have been sacrificed, how many £1,000 worth of property plundered, and how much misery and suffering to individuals has this daring breach of a public duty occasioned? But to my narrative. The captain not having returned on the following morning, the schooner weighed and ran down to the Victoria, and on the same day 2 vessels arrived for the coffee from the Havana. These were immediately laden, and the Victoria, having become lighter in consequence of the discharge of so much of her cargo, floated off the reef. Sail was immediately made on her, and both vessels directed their course towards Rio Omedia the next day. In the afternoon, however, the Jamaica fleet hove in sight, and the Victoria was once more drawn on the outer edge of the reef, while the corsair stood in and anchored. Here again was another culpable instance of neglect. The whole fleet, with the man of war at their head, passed within a league of the place where the Victoria was lying full in their view, and evidently a prize to the pirates. Yet no notice whatever was taken. At that moment one boat would have captured both vessels, as a great number of the corsair's crew were absent, and his means of defense were consequently weakened. The pirates in the Rio Omedia had now become too notorious for the government to countenance them any longer, and a body of police was consequently dispatched, bringing with them instructions to the magistrates to give them every assistance in their search for plundered property. This information no sooner reached the old magistrate than he sent down to the Dutch vessel, took out the men on board, and dispatched them to the corsair, and then set fire to her where she was. She soon burned to the water's edge, and then floating, was carried away by the current, so that not a vestige remained. The Victoria, in the meantime, had been got off the reef a second time, and, having been brought into the harbor, was run upon a mud bank, while the corsair gave notice to the inhabitants of her safe return by discharging her guns. A message soon after arrived from the captain at Caso Blanco, desiring that the Dutchman might be instantly set at liberty, and sent away on board a small vessel belonging to the pirates, and that a boat might be dispatched for him. This messenger informed us that a party of police, 30 in number, had been searching through the villages for plundered property. But as soon as the report of the corsair's guns had reached their ears, they made a precipitate retreat. Such was the dependence that was to be placed on those cowardly wretches. The Dutch prisoners were released, and sent away the following day, but what became of them I never heard. Whether they succeeded in reaching their native shore, or whether they were, like myself, apprehended on charges of piracy, as they had assisted as well in several captures, and were not so fortunate in being able to establish their innocence, is a question that I am unable to answer. They were released, however, according to the order, and I envied them their fate. The magistrate and Seraphina soon after visited us. The former confirmed the tale of the messenger relative to the conduct of the police. They were accompanied by a number of young ladies who, Seraphina informed me, having heard of my case, had come to consult me. She lamented bitterly our disappointment, and told me that the cause of it was now suffering for his perfidy in a prison. 2 priests and a magistrate, accompanied by 4 females, added to the number of the company on board. These visits appeared to be for the sake of getting what they could from the pirates. The priests, as usual, exercised all the chicanery of their craft, and were well paid for it. They visited the Victoria, and took all her charts and maps for household ornaments, and having returned on board, caroused till dusk, when the whole party took their leave. On the second day the captain returned, and was furious when informed of the circumstances of the Victoria, so much so that the pilot who had been on board of her narrowly escaped with his life. The third mate soon after arrived with 2 coasting vessels from the Havana, which were speedily loaded with the remainder of the Victoria's cargo. The pirates at all times found great facility in disposing of their plunder by these coasting vessels, who were always ready not only to receive it, but also frequently lent their crews to assist in the capture and to board vessels. A whole week had nearly passed without any remarkable occurrence, when another piratical schooner entered Rio Omedia. Her captain informed us that he had plundered 3 English vessels, out of one of which he had detained a carpenter, who, he said, was an excellent workman. This unfortunate wretch I did not see, but I was informed that he was assassinated as soon as he had completed the task for which he had been detained, and I have no reason to disbelieve it. From the conversation of the pirate, I learned the system on which these vessels are fitted out. He informed our captain that he had entered into an agreement with the owner to put guns, muskets, and every other article secretly on board at the Havana, and then clear her out, as it were for a neighboring port, in charge of a master. At night, when she anchored along the coast, he boarded and took possession of her, setting the master ashore. The owner, on receiving the intelligence, made a complaint to the governor that his vessel was seized by pirates, and the master confirming it by his statement, everybody believed it to be the fact, while the other was sharing the plunder, without the suspicion of being particeps criminis. Having completed her fitting out with sails and spars from the Victoria, at the end of 5 days the pirate took his departure. A few days after, the corsair captured a French vessel from Vera Cruz, with a large quantity of specie on board. The Frenchman was rather obstinate in his endeavor to conceal the money, and I witnessed a repetition of the brutality practiced on former occasions, by which means a confession was extorted, and the specie found. The money on board was chiefly in dollars, and the captain sent word on shore that he would give a premium of $4 on every doubloon. This favorable rate of exchange soon brought priests and magistrates on board, particularly the former, and these holy men, by these means, became partakers of 1/4 of the plunder. I became at this time very ill with an attack of fever, and my wounds broke out afresh. I attributed this to the closeness of the ship, from the prisoners being kept constantly below, and, for the sake of my own health, as well as others, suggested it to the captain, who allowed them to walk the deck during the day. When I had recovered a little, an American brig fell into their hands, but the captain having at once delivered up his money, and pointed out the most valuable part of his cargo, was very well treated by the pirate. His watch, however, had attracted the notice of the prize master, and, as he did not surrender that so readily, he was on the point of being assassinated. But, to save his life, he gave it up, although he wanted to recover it, when released subsequently, declaring, on that occasion, that he had only lent it under promise of having it restored when done with. The crew of the French vessel was transferred to the American on the following day, and she was piloted out of the reef and allowed to go on her voyage. An attack of intermittent fever shortly after confined me to my mattress. Under this fit of illness I labored for 15 days, and was much reduced. During all this time I was left to shift for myself, but experienced much kindness and attention from Seraphina, who, when she heard of my illness, frequently visited me, and brought with her every little thing that she thought might conduce to my comfort. When I had partially recovered, I solicited permission to go on shore, but the request was brutally denied under the plea that I only wished to escape. Soon after this refusal, while I was on deck one very calm morning, a schooner was discovered in the offing. I was peremptorily ordered aloft to look at her, and had begun to ascend the rigging, but so weak and exhausted was I that I expected to fall every moment. The captain observed my condition, and for once had the humanity to desire me to remain on deck, and went aloft himself. When he came down, a boat with armed men was dispatched to board, as it was a dead calm, and the corsair would have made very little way herself had her anchor been weighed. The boat's crew took possession of her without any resistance, although the schooner was large and well manned. A breeze springing up soon after they were in possession, they brought their prize into the harbor, when the captain went on board of her. As soon as he returned, he informed me that the prize was an American, and that she had on board of her, as passengers, a Spanish officer and his wife. But the latter, he added, was extremely ill from seasickness and the bad treatment of the captain, who had been brute enough to deny her many little comforts, and requested I would go on board and prescribe for her. He was much exasperated against the captain for this act, and was determined to murder him, and the finding no money on board tended not a little to confirm him in his resolution. In a short time, however, the officer and his wife were brought on board the corsair, and I was saved the fatigue of visiting the prize. I confess I had no difficulty in prescribing for her, nourishment being all that she required, but she was evidently in a delicate state of health. Her husband appeared to be a great brute, and to care very little about her, as he began to drink and carouse with the pirates almost as soon as he came on board, paying no attention to his wife. I took the opportunity of my attending on her to inform her of the captain's threat, and prevailed upon her to join her entreaties with mine that the American's life might be spared. She did so when the pirate visited her, and at our joint solicitation he escaped that summary punishment which he had drawn down upon his head for his unfeeling conduct to this poor woman. It was customary with the pirate to make the crew of a prize, if possible, drunk, in order, in that unguarded moment, to obtain from them a knowledge of all that was on board. He had on this occasion been very liberal in his allowance of spirits to the crew of the schooner, who were prisoners on board, and were partly Irish. Intoxication soon led to quarreling, and a fight then took place, which afforded very great merriment to the pirates, who laughed very heartily at it. The officer and his wife had a mattress prepared for them next to mine in the cabin, where they slept that night. To the latter I was very assiduous in my attentions, and made up little messes of arrowroot and wine, and did all in my power to administer to her comfort. For these attentions she was remarkably grateful, but manifested a degree of warmth in her gratitude that I was fearful would lead to serious consequences. One night, after we had retired to our respective mattresses, I was surprised, when I awoke about midnight, to find the lady by my side, and her arm thrown round my neck, fast asleep. I awakened her gently, and respectfully informed her of her mistake. She made no reply, but returned to the side of her lawful spouse. I looked upon this as a mere accident arising from the contiguity of our mattresses, and therefore thought no more of it. On the following night, however, I was again roused from my slumbers by her caresses, but on this occasion the consequences were nearly fatal to me. The husband awoke just at the same instant, and missing his wife and seeing her by my side, vociferated so loudly as to awaken both her and the captain, but I thought it most prudent for myself to counterfeit sleep. At her first awakening she gave a faint scream, but soon recovered her presence of mind and succeeded in pacifying her enraged husband, whom she convinced that the mistake had occurred in her sleep, and that his honor remained uninjured, which he the more readily believed, from my being apparently asleep. The pirate, who at first had felt inclined to treat the matter seriously, now burst into a loud laugh, in which I could scarce refrain from joining. For several days the corsair remained out at sea, having on board the American crew, and cruised backwards and forwards in hope of falling in with the Peacock, of New York, which the captain of the prize had informed the pirate was to touch at the Havana, and was richly laden, having besides a large quantity of specie on board. Whether the other had invented the information with the hope of being more speedily liberated, or whether the Peacock had been fortunate enough to escape the pirate's vigilance, I do not know; but after an ineffectual cruise of some days, he returned into harbor and gave up the pursuit. In revenge he plundered the schooner he had captured, and having taken out everything of any value, he gave her up to the crew, and ordered them to go to New Orleans, but on the peril of their lives not to pursue their voyage to the Havana. The Spanish officer, when he heard the mandate, begged to be detained on board, and to be sent thither the first favorable opportunity. As the pirate did not apprehend any bad consequences from this indulgence, his request was granted, and the American sailed without him. Ever since the occurrences of that evening, the Spaniard kept a jealous eye upon his fair partner, and I was equally reserved and cautious in my communications with her. But her own imprudence had nearly rendered all my precautions abortive. I was below in the cabin, mixing some medicine for a sick man, when the lady slipped from her husband and came down. She had no sooner entered the cabin than she seated herself on my knee, and very familiarly putting her arm round my neck, gave me a kiss. The officer, who had followed her almost the instant she left him, entered at the moment, and, with most furious gesticulation, rushed upon deck, and called upon the captain to inflict summary punishment upon me. The lady, however, stood my friend on this occasion as on the former, and declared that her husband must have been mistaken, as no such thing had occurred. She then explained the cause of being seen on my knee, and said that she had slipped in consequence of the motion of the vessel, and I had caught her in my arms and had saved her from falling and seriously hurting herself. As there was a swell, and the vessel occasionally gave a lurch, the tale had the air of probability, and the captain declared that punishment was out of the case. The officer put on a constrained air of satisfaction, but I was convinced he would watch an opportunity of revenge, and was not at all sorry when, on the following day, he took his departure in a coasting schooner, his expenses being defrayed by the pirate. All this time the Victoria lay on the mud bank, exposed to the full view of every ship that passed, yet no attempts were made to recapture her. The pirate used often to say in joke that the naval officers on the station thought it better amusement to drink and enter into every species of debauchery at the Havana than to look after pirates, or attempt to attack them; and from what I myself experienced, I verily believe the assertion to be fact. Nothing of importance occurred for several days, and the corsair remained quietly at anchor. One night, however, a letter was brought from the magistrate, intimating that the Governor of the Havana had adopted hostile measures, and that 100 soldiers were expected over land, and that 5 gunboats were to come down inside the reef in 4 or 5 days, and therefore advised him to be on his guard. On the following morning the magistrate himself came on board, and added that he had received the most positive orders to render every assistance, by information or otherwise, to this armament. He then advised the captain to destroy the Victoria as soon as ever the forces approached, of which he would give him a signal. The pirate now became apprehensive for his own safety, and resolved to go to Cape Sant Antonio for a while. This resolution he communicated to the magistrate, and obtained a promise from him to send a boat with communications of all that might occur in his absence. These preliminaries having been arranged, preparations were made for sailing, and the magistrate took his leave. On the following morning we proceeded outside the reef down to Cape Sant Antonio, and came to an anchor off that place. The magistrate, who was apprehensive of consequences, destroyed the Victoria the day after the pirates sailed. The corsair had lain at anchor for 10 days, but still no information reached her of the expected armament, and all began to look upon it as a false alarm. About 9 o'clock of the evening of the 11th day, however, the promised boat arrived to inform the pirate that he might expect the gunboats at Cape Sant Antonio on the following day. After having performed his mission, the messenger immediately returned, in order to pass the boats unobserved while it was dark, and every preparation was made on board to prevent surprise. The morning was fine, clear, and calm. There was not a ripple on the sea. Its surface was like a mirror, and not a breath of air was stirring. The gunboats were discovered at an early hour pulling towards the corsair, who did not seem disposed to wait their arrival. The anchor was quickly weighed, and with her sweeps she was taken without the reef. The boats were about 3 miles from her, and, with a glass, all the movements could be distinctly observed. Had the officers who commanded them possessed the least spirit of enterprise, the corsair must have fallen into their hands; but my firm belief is that they were as much afraid of attacking the pirate as he was that they would attack him. He had become desperate, and had resolved upon not yielding easily, declaring he would do his utmost to sink them. At noon a breeze sprung up, of which the corsair took advantage, and ran for Rio Omedia, while the gunboats came to an anchor. The anchor was scarcely down when the magistrate was on board to inform the captain that the Victoria's capture was unknown to the troops and gunboats, as she was totally destroyed before their arrival, and that the latter would remain off the Cape for some days. Having so far obliged his friend, he departed, promising to repeat his visit on the following day, accompanied by several others who were coming to congratulate him. The night was spent in watchfulness, and the day brought the promised party, consisting of the old magistrate and his daughter, with 3 or 4 ladies and several other magistrates and priests. The whole were well entertained on board, and the latter were by no means sparing of the wines and spirits that were set before them. Seraphina seized the first opportunity of informing me of all that she had done during my absence, and raised my hopes by saying that she had engaged another and more trustworthy guide for our escape, and that it only wanted an opportunity to avail ourselves of his services. We dwelt upon this interesting theme, devising the means, when a general movement for departure broke off our conversation. She took a warm and affectionate leave of me for the night, and this was the last interview I had with this kind, warm-hearted, and benevolent creature. Her kindness soothed me in my captivity, and I shall never forget her. Section 7, Part 7. On the following morning the corsair sailed for the Morelia, where she remained idle for nearly 3 weeks. At the end of that time a French vessel fell into the hands of the pirate. The usual scene of cruelty and atrocity took place, and, when they had taken all the money and the valuable part of her cargo, and destroyed and damaged the remainder, they cut away her mizzenmast and starboard main rigging, and in that crippled state dismissed them to pursue their voyage, forbidding them, however, to go to the Havana. The pirate returned with his plunder into the Morelia, where he anchored. Discord, however, began to rear her head among this horde of savages. Some one had insinuated that they had not been fairly dealt by, and that the captain had secreted large sums for himself. Discontent manifested itself, first in whispered insinuations, and at last in open accusations, and two parties were consequently formed, one who believed him innocent and the other guilty. Things were in this state, and each waiting only for a plausible pretext to attack the other, when murder and massacre would have ensued, but an unexpected event suspended the quarrel. The man at the masthead descried the gunboats steering towards the corsair, and they were shortly after heard to scale their guns. These warlike preparations seemed to denote an immediate attack, and their private animosities were forgotten in the hurry of self-defense. The alarm, however, was without foundation, for they all passed on without noticing the pirate. A fisherman, who boarded the schooner soon after, informed us that the commanding officer of the flotilla had told him that he was well aware that the schooner was a pirate, but that he had no time to go in chase of her, as he was on his return. Thus ended this boasted expedition for the suppression of piracy, without effecting one single object for which it was furnished and sent out. And no wonder, for I am convinced, from personal observation, that from the governor to the mere clerk or officer, all derive some degree of benefit from the acts of those lawless ruffians, and therefore it is against their interest to injure them. The discontent that existed previous to the late alarm now broke out afresh, and the two parties would have proceeded to extremities but for the timely arrival of two gentlemen from the Havana, who I understood were the owners of the corsair. By their interference, all differences were arranged, and the newly acquired plunder being shipped on board two coasting vessels, they returned with them. The captain, on the following day, was attacked by a fever, and felt himself so indisposed that he was apprehensive of death. He sent for me in a terrible state of alarm, and promised me my liberty if I cured him. The promise I knew would be broken the moment he was well, so I resolved to take advantage of his illness to make my escape. For this I thought the best thing would be to confine him to the cabin, and as he promised to follow my directions implicitly, I gave this injunction the first thing, and an opportunity soon after offered. Two fishermen came on board on the following afternoon, and exchanged their cargo of fish for spirits. The evening being wet and stormy, they remained on board, and the crew inviting them to carouse, the whole were very shortly intoxicated. No further danger from the gunboats being apprehended, the watch was neglected, and the moment I perceived this fancied state of security, hope dawned in my bosom. I knew that intoxication would make the rest sleep sound, and in order to secure the captain in making him a mess of arrow root and wine, I infused a quantity of opiate. At midnight all were asleep. The inclemency of the night had driven the usual sleepers on deck below, and therefore no one could see me. Not a sound was heard save the sullen roar of the waters around me, or the wind and the rain beating against the shrouds. Not a star was to be seen, and the scud was flying thick and heavy. With a palpitating heart I seized my bag that held my instruments, and in which I had secured some biscuit, and crept softly up the companion ladder, and from thence to the stern of the corsair, where the fisherman's canoe was moored. Into this I gently dropped my bag, and then, letting myself down, cut the painter, and let her drift away with the current, in order not to rouse them by any noise. When I judged myself to be out of hearing, I trimmed the canoe and set the sail, steering her in the direction, as I imagined, of the Havana, and committing my future fate to the hands of that Providence who had hitherto preserved me. In the morning, according to my calculation, I found myself about 40 miles from the place where the pirate was at anchor, and consequently out of the reach of pursuit. The wind blew from the southwest, and what appeared to me a special providence continued to do so the whole day, a thing very unusual in that climate. All that day and the following night I was upon the ocean without seeing a single vessel, and at the mercy of the waves in a frail canoe in which, at any other time and under any other circumstances, I should have been afraid to trust myself. At 6 o'clock of the second morning of my escape, I entered the Havana, and seeing a person walking the deck of a schooner whose face appeared familiar to me, I ran my canoe alongside, and found him to be a Captain Williams, whom I had known some years before in America. He welcomed me on board, gave me refreshments, and seeing me weak and exhausted, begged me to lie down and sleep, promising in the afternoon to introduce me to the master of a vessel who was in want of a mate. I willingly complied with his request, for I was completely faint and exhausted with my exertions of the day and night previous. I now imagined my sufferings were at an end, but alas! I had yet to pass through another ordeal, as cruel and as severe as that from which I had just escaped. When I awoke from a profound sleep in the afternoon, I found that Captain Williams had gone ashore, leaving directions with his mate where I should find him. I prevailed upon him to land me, and, while proceeding up the front street, according to my directions, I met one of the men belonging to the pirate, who, the moment he saw me, ran on before till he arrived at the corner of a street, up which he turned, and I saw no more of him. I had advanced a very few paces further, when the Spanish officer who had been on board the pirate came from that direction, with a file of soldiers, and immediately arrested me as a pirate, and, charging me with having robbed him of specie to a large amount, conducted me to the governor's offices. From thence I was taken to the prison, where I was immured in a dark dungeon, swarming with vermin, and there left without anything to cover me, and nothing but the bare floor to lie on. My daily allowance was 2 ounces of meat, 2 of bread, and a pint of rice. In this place I was a solitary prisoner for 2 days, and on the third underwent an examination, something similar in mode to those at our own police offices, except that in this instance a judge presided. The governor's interpreter, an Irishman, was the medium through whom I was interrogated, as the judge did not understand English. This fellow, whose name is Payne, I found to be a most unprincipled and base scoundrel, a disgrace to any nation. The interrogations were put to me by this man in English, and the answers interpreted and committed to paper in Spanish. In the course of the examination I detailed every circumstance of my capture and forcible detention, and the cruelties I had endured, and also to different questions gave a full account of all the vessels at the capturing of which I either assisted or had been present. This Payne told me that Mr. Lumsden had already made every particular known. I represented to him the deplorable situation in which I was, without friends, money, or clothes, in a foreign land, but the only consolation I received was that I should most likely be liberated after another examination, as the judge could not, under present circumstances, attach any guilt to me. My examination being concluded, I was reconducted to my dungeon, where I was kept closely confined till the following day, and then allowed to go into a yard containing 400 or 500 prisoners of all nations, and many of the very worst description. I had scarcely entered the place, when a sturdy looking villain came up to me and demanded my trousers, insisting that I should strip them off instantly. A Spaniard, who had formerly sailed with me in a brig, of which I was master, and who was also a prisoner at the moment, recognized me, and endeavored to prevent him; but the sturdy villain was determined to have them, and I was actually obliged to battle, and wound him with the knife, of which I learned the use, to please the pirate, before he would forego his demand. I afterwards found that it was the practice of these fellows to rob all English and American sailors who were unfortunate enough to become inmates of the jail, of whatever necessaries they might have. From the Spanish sailor I received many little acts of kindness. He procured me a bedstead to lie upon, would bring me my victuals, and, in order to put me in the way of earning trifling sums to supply my little wants, taught me to make cigars, at which trade he himself earned several dollars a week, and worked for one of the largest cigar shops in the town. 5 weeks elapsed, instead of 2 days, before I was called up for a second examination. At this I was informed that the only accusation against me was the affidavit of the Spanish officer, who was now gone to Europe, and in this he deposed, on oath, that I was one of a crew of pirates who had robbed him of specie to a large amount. My former deposition was then read over to me, but what was my astonishment to find that every syllable of that part which related to my capture and forcible detention had been omitted, and many other things inserted that I had never uttered. I remarked this, when the Irishman, with a degree of violence, and in an authoritative tone, declared that I had never asserted anything on the subject. A warm altercation then took place, in which I accused him as the author of my long imprisonment and my sufferings while confined; while he, with all the voluble scurrility of his countrymen, lavished every degrading epithet on me, and concluded by a threat to represent me to the Governor as a piratical scoundrel. The judge now asked this fellow what had occurred, to which he imprudently replied, "Nothing." But, to his utter dismay, I immediately answered in Spanish, and, as well as I could, explained the whole matter in dispute. The judge immediately answered me, and said that, as I was a foreigner and unacquainted with their laws, he would show me every indulgence in his power, and allow me to correct all misinterpretations; that he would then go on with my examination, and that an additional interpreter should be employed as I had requested. I was then remanded to prison, and brought up the following day. On this day I pointed out the objectionable passages in the former deposition, all which, although strenuously opposed by this renegade Irishman, were erased from the record. One of the additional interpreters on this occasion was Mr. Gassier, the harbor master, who said he was ready to depose on oath that Mr. Lumsden had declared that I was forcibly detained, and that the substance of that declaration was contained in a protest deposited in one of the public notary's offices. The judge on this declared that he would examine the protest, and that if such was the fact, I should be recommended to the favorable attention of the Governor. Having said this, he remanded me once more. During the interval between this and my final examination, a serious quarrel took place among the prisoners, in which 5 were killed and several wounded, and it was not until the military were called that order could be restored. The imprecations, cries, and groans during its continuance were truly appalling. After languishing several weeks in this jail, I was, at last, brought up before the Governor, who sat attended by his Secretary at War and 2 judges. Previous to being arraigned, I was asked whether I would be tried by the Spanish laws or given up to my own government, and was informed that Captain Lelcroft, of the Hyperion, then in port, had demanded to have me sent to Jamaica, but that he had refused to comply with the demand, as the pirate was a Spanish vessel and manned by Spaniards, and that, therefore, I was amenable to the laws of Spain. He said, however, that I should have my choice. I immediately begged that, as the whole of the circumstances of my case were known in the Havana, I might be tried on the spot. The usual forms having been gone through, I entered on my defense, and recapitulated the whole of the circumstances from the capture to the moment of my escape and apprehension, dwelling forcibly upon every fact, and pointing out the injury I had sustained, not only in loss of property, but, what was far dearer to me, the loss of character, praying him to consider at the same time that I was at a distance of 4,000 miles from my native country, and destitute of every means. The Governor heard me with the greatest attention, and my narrative evidently excited great interest in his mind. When I had ceased speaking, he turned round and consulted the persons upon the bench with him, and having received an affirmative answer from the judge who had examined me as to the truth of my statements, he addressed me in nearly the following words: "In considering your case, and giving due weight to all the circumstances set forth, both in your deposition and what you have this day laid before me, I am decidedly of opinion that you are rather an object for pity and commiseration than for prosecution. One point must, however, be inquired into before I can decide in what way the court will dispose of you. The admiral on the Jamaica station has made a formal application that you should be surrendered into his hands, and be at his disposal. As I know not what right he has to make this demand, or if he has the right, whether it would be consistent with the laws of Spain, and my own duty to comply with it, I must necessarily consult with the law authorities upon the subject. Your case shall have the earliest consideration, and be brought to as speedy a conclusion as the rules of this court will admit. But, in the meantime, you must remain as you are." I bowed when he had concluded, and was reconducted in the usual manner to my prison. I had been kept in painful suspense for some days, when, one forenoon, one of the judges entered the prison yard. "Your case has been decided, young man," said he, coming up to me, "and you are to be surrendered into the hands of the admiral." "Be it so," said I. "My conscience acquits me of having committed any crime, and therefore I care not into whose hands I am surrendered." "It will be a hard case for you," continued this upright judge, "to be dragged to Jamaica a prisoner, and be tried a second time. But come, you know you have been among the pirates, and have plenty of money. If you will give me and my brother judge what you have, you shall be released forthwith, and go where you please." My blood boiled within me. "If my liberty depends," said I haughtily, "upon what money I can give, I must needs be a prisoner all my life. I never partook of the fruits of their iniquity, and have not wherewithal at this moment to purchase the common necessaries of life." "Weigh well the proposal, young man," cried he, with unblushing effrontery. "My interest never fails. To it the 4 pirates, who were released the other day, are indebted for their safety, and from them I received 400 doubloons." I replied that I had no doubloons to give him. "Then I cannot interfere for you," said he coolly, and departed. The pirates whom he had liberated had actually been convicted, and for this paltry bribe had justice been violated, and they had escaped the fate they merited. Thus are the laws of Spain administered in the island of Cuba. Confinement, bad diet, and agitation of mind threw me shortly into a fever, under the effects of which I labored for 10 days, and at one time I thought it would have released me from my sufferings. But I recovered, and recovered only to meet with inhumanity where I least expected it, from an Englishman, an admiral in his Majesty's service. I was one day called out of my bed to the gate, where I found a lieutenant of the Sybil, Admiral Sir Charles Rowley's flag ship, who informed me that he was going to have me liberated, and then left me. On the following day I found 3 naval officers at the gate, who, with a guard of Spanish soldiers, took me down to the beach, where the Sibyl's boat was in waiting. I was then, in due form, surrendered to the British Government, and taken on board. What was my astonishment when I reached the deck, to hear the order that I was to be taken below and put into double irons. This was the liberty that was promised. I was taken from where my limbs at least were free, to be manacled like a felon on board of a British admiral's flag ship. My wounds were still open, and my leg was swelled. I pointed out the excruciating pain that irons upon it would cause, and hoped that, if Sir Charles was determined to confine me, he would not torture me. The petty officers pitied me, but were obliged to obey their orders, and all they could do was to promise to report my request and inform the surgeon. The ship's corporal shortly after returned, saying that no orders had been given on the subject of my leg, but that the barber was to attend me, and I was then to be taken to the forecastle and washed with cold water. Remonstrance was fruitless. I was compelled to submit to this order, and contracted so severe a cold from the effects of my submersion, that I shall never completely recover from it. This order having been complied with to the very letter, I was taken below and again double ironed, and, in this torture, I was kept till the following day, when the admiral visited me, accompanied by Captain Rowley. To the latter kind, generous, and truly humane man I feel most grateful for alleviating my misery, and doing all in his power to render my confinement as little irksome to me as was possible. The iron from my wounded leg was removed by his interference, and the surgeon sent to dress it. From this medical man also, whose name I unfortunately have forgotten, I received the greatest kindness and attention, and I take this opportunity of expressing my gratitude to him. When the Sybil arrived in the higher latitudes, Captain Rowley's humanity was again conspicuously displayed. Seeing me thinly clad, he procured me warmer clothing, and, when he found that the purser had no blankets, gave me one from his own bed to cover me. During the whole voyage I was kept out of irons, with a sentry only over me, to prevent me from conversing with any one, and even this restraint would, I am sure, have been dispensed with, had he been in command. On the arrival of the Sybil at the Isle of Wight, I was put in single irons. The vessel went round to Spithead, the admiral struck his flag, and she was soon after brought to Deptford. A visible change took place as soon as the admiral left, and my situation was rendered less irksome. In short, I cannot speak in too high terms of the kindness and humanity of all the officers, particularly Lieutenant Bennett. When the Sybil was taken out of commission, I was transferred to the Aske tender, commanded by Lieutenant Weeks, and by him conveyed on board the Genoa guardship at Sheerness. Of the wanton severity and petty insults which I received from this officer during the few hours I was in his charge, I shall say nothing. By the officers of the Genoa I was treated in the most humane and gentlemanlike manner, and to Lieutenant Hopkins and them my warmest thanks are due. After being 6 days on board, I was sent up to London in the charge of Lieutenant Hallowell and another officer whose name has escaped me, and was treated with uniform kindness and humanity. In London I was examined before Mr. Richbald, the presiding magistrate of the Thames Police, and by him committed to Newgate, and tried and acquitted at the ensuing Admiralty sessions. Thus has ended a series of unparalleled sufferings and persecutions, all occasioned by the obstinate infatuation of a single individual, who had not the common feelings of humanity afterwards to come forward himself in my behalf. And God forbid that such should ever fall to the lot of any man. Finis. End of Section 7, Part 7. End of the Atrocities of the Pirates by Aaron Smith.